delighted to and want to thank our guest speakers, our discussants, and Jean Molato for agreeing to chair this session. We have an hour and a half, more or less, with the first part, a coffee. Oh, thank you. A coffee break, and after that we will have our final keynote, followed by a very quick wrap-up, and hopefully we will be honored to have the presence of our Minister of Science to come and close, finally, our annual conference for us. So I hope this will all work fine, and I pass the word to Jean for opening this afternoon's session. Thank you.
Excellent. So good afternoon to everyone. This is the first half of the last day, and what we're going to have is, it's working. What we're going to have is a debate on the issue of the rights and the city. And joining me in this debate, I have three guests. One of them, not really a guest, is a colleague of ours. But here on my right, on your left, we have Melissa Garcia-Lamarca. She's a researcher at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And Melissa's research, for those of you who don't know her work, focus mostly on the structural, political, economic dynamics and bottom-up struggle processes that underpin more socially just and emancipatory cities. Fair enough? Yes, good. Here on my left, your right, we have Jorge Malheiros. For those of you that have been in Portugal for a while, I think within the urban studies community, Jorge Malheiros is a household name. But nevertheless, Jorge is a research fellow and a professor at the Center for Geographic Studies and the Institute of Geography and Spatial Planning of the University of Lisbon. And he has a long research career focusing on migrant integration and demography and its urban social features such as spatial segregation, housing access, and so on and so on. And here to my far left, your far right, we have Pedro Magalhães. Pedro is our colleague he's a senior research fellow here at ICS, and his research interests focus mostly on electoral behavior, social and political attitudes, public opinion, survey research, and judicial and constitutional politics. I hope this made you justice. Yes? Good. So what are we going to do today? I am going to do a brief introduction to the topic, and then we structure this debate around three main questions. Each of our guests is going to have a go at one of those three questions, and then there's going to be a short interaction with the audience, and in the end, Pedro will do a final comment and a wrap-up. And this is going to last around 1.5 hours, and then we have a coffee break to refresh and basically fuel up for the remaining of the session today. So, what is the issue today? Why are we here? There are two main points that I want to make. The main reason we created this session and gave it this name, The Rights to the City, was a revisiting of Lefebvre's the Right to the City from the late 60s. The issue is that the right of the city, as outlined by Lefebvre, has changed tremendously. And it has changed because it has gained multiple layers, additional layers to the original layers that the right of the city was supposed to enclose. We are now discussing multiple types of rights: housing rights, property rights, emancipatory rights, identity rights, gender rights, access to political representation rights, citizenship rights. It is a multitude of rights that are now fitting in this discussion of the right to the city. And if we live in a growingly urbanized world, and apparently inevitably urbanized world, then the debate on the right to the city needs to be revisited, and that is the purpose of what we're doing today. The second point that I want to make has to do with a recent surge in the non-academic literature, the so-called influential books. And this surge has to do with two main topics. One, the end of democracy. There's a growing number of titles that focus on the end of democracy. And two, after a decade of a strong criticism of neoliberal capitalism, we're now seeing a surge of books that actually outline alternatives to the current neoliberal capitalist paradigm. Two examples. There is A Future of Capitalism and How to Face New Anxieties by Paul Collier. And more recently, and as recent as 5 days ago, Joseph Stiglitz published a title called After Neoliberalism. And After Neoliberalism is a tremendously interesting book because regardless if we agree with him or not, at least the discussion is focused on an alternative with a very, very strong degree of detail. So if we have this in mind, these two approaches, we then reach my final point. And my final point has to do with a book by Geoff Mann that we were discussing earlier on called Climate Leviathan, meaning very much like Hobbes' Leviathan centuries ago, you know, the discussion of a social contract, a relationship between societal rules and societal roles. Climate Leviathan wants to revisit that discussion in face of the climate emergency that we experience today. And so if we bring these three ideas to play, there are two things that we can conclude. And number one, these are basically two classic quotes that are very useful in this situation. The first one has to do with, you know, Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks. When Antonio Gramsci said that, well, we're not really anywhere. We are somewhere in between an old system that is dying out and a new system that doesn't really have space to be born yet. So it is very important to understand what goes on in between these moments in time. And the second quote has to do with Hannah Arendt's famous line of, we move faster, we move with a much, much greater determination when we are when we are aware of the possibility of a doomsday. So the idea here is how this doomsday, and by doomsday metaphorically, I'm referring to the climate emergency that we experience nowadays, how does this doomsday affect a discussion of the right to the city as we know it today, and how it will affect the future of the right to the city. So this was basically the framework that was given to our dear guests. And the first question, which is wide open, to allow for any sort of reply, is basically how will climate politics affect the discussion and pursuit of the contemporary rights to the city? What is there that is new? What is there that is not new? How can we manage all discussions and the forthcoming ones? And the first person that has a go at this answer, at this question, is going to be Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you, João, for the introduction, and thank you for coming today and for inviting me to be here. So when I was first, can you hear me? Yeah? When I was first thinking about this question, the first thing that came to my mind was something maybe controversial or polemic to respond to it. First, by thinking about the right to the city today as it exists today, and I would say blatantly that it doesn't exist, the right to the city. And any city I can think of. I mean, if we think about the original way that Lefebvre thought about the right to the city, it was a very radical reimagining of urban life and the possibility of cities as a place of work, of enjoyment and expression, where use value reigns. And you know what we see now, if we look at most of our cities, are construction cranes and development projects and housing for middle class, upper middle classes. So if we think of the right to the city as something rethinking the social relations of capitalism, the spatial structure of the city, and the assumptions of liberal democracy, I would say the right to the city today doesn't exist. So I wanted to start with that, because I think we need to think about how this would work, if the right to the city seizes the center for people, the center of the city for people, not for capital. And I think, I live in Barcelona, I work at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and there's a lot of talk about the radical municipalism that's happening in the city, and this new political formation, Barcelona en Comú, which maybe you've heard about, which is trying to implement some of these new radical ways of thinking and ideas. But at the same time, we still have 6 evictions every day in Barcelona. There's still all sorts of, economic and political realities that are acting against the rights of the city. And in terms of bringing in the idea of climate justice, this is something that the city talks about in its plan. But at the same time, there's kind of these perverse things at play where one of the interventions to address climate change in Barcelona are the superillas, or super blocks, which you might be familiar with. Some urbanists in the room are basically taking the Eixample, the extension of the city of Barcelona, taking 3 blocks by 3 blocks and closing off the interior streets for pedestrians and for public space use. So the idea of this is to give the city to the people in these spaces where people can use these as places for interaction and meetings and for gardening, for all sorts of different uses. But there's this perverse thing happening where there's a lot of speculation occurring around these new spaces. So the price of housing is going up, and so this is again creating an exclusionary process, which is again defying the right to the city for many people. So I think in terms of the progressive left is operating within the confines of the system that we exist in, this capitalist urban dynamic, which is extremely hard to break out of. And if we think about the kind of radical change we need to address this climate politics, we need to start to think about the distribution of resources that exist between humans, where we live in a world there's 1% of the population controls almost half of the world's wealth. So we already have these existing huge inequalities. So the question is, if we want to think about the rights of and the relationship between humans and nature and how to make this politicize this relationship, we have to think about first our relationships as humans, because I'm thinking about the right to the city and the new types of rights that are coming up. For example, in Ecuador, there's this idea of the rights to nature. I don't know if you've heard of this. But in the Constitution, the idea is that giving nature recognition and that nature should have rights. I mean, there's the question of who speaks for nature and these sorts of things, of course. But in the end of the day, this ends up being, in Spanish we say it's papel mojado. It's like worthless scraps of paper. A lot of these kind of things we have written around these declarations for the rights of housing, for the rights of nature, for these kind of rights that are really critical for bringing this kind of a more emancipatory city. In practice, they're not. They don't have any role there. So, I mean, I think one of the key points I wanted to bring up in this question is, I think there's a question of scale that's really critical that we have to address, that's really tricky, because climate change is a macro-planetary process which has local manifestations, but it has very differential local impacts. Well, at the same time, the right to the city, the scale of action is very micro, it's much more local based. So I think, there's this big challenge of, okay, we have climate politics or climate change, which is this global process, but then we have the local where we act and where we implement our rights. And in closing, I think it's important to say that climate politics are already impacting the mechanisms of production and reproduction of inequalities in cities. So I was reading there's a special issue coming out in Antipode, the geography journal, about the Anthropocene and climate change and climate justice, abolitionist climate justice. And it's talking about how a lot of extreme weather events already have unequal race and class geographies. So of course, wealthy people can afford to build back in cities and reclaim important places in the city after the kind of impacts that climate change is bringing, where the brown and black people and lower class, working class people are the ones who it's creating new inequalities and reinforcing inequalities. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it over to George.
So George, Melissa says there isn't a right to the city. What are your views?
What are my views? Yeah, okay.
Simple question.
Good afternoon. And first, I think it's. I want to say this. I want to congratulate the ICS for this organization and for the topics. So I think it's coming from the other side of the street, literally. I think it's a very good initiative, and I believe it joins people with interests in such a thing which combines several of us which came from, let us say, distinct disciplinary areas. but that share the same worries about the future of the urban world and in connection with these environmental issues and the distinct types of crises. So I want to congratulate you for this, and it is a pleasure to be here and to keep this dialogue from both sides of this street where the both institutions are. Concerning the question, well, I think the right of the city exists, so let us have some debate. Why do I say it exists? Because if we put the right of the city in the context when Lefebvre wrote, in that sense we can understand it as something that is no longer there, or today is no longer here, because it's a different thing. But as circumstances have changed, I think we have to read the right of the city, and it's your merit, João, when you wrote the text for us. We have to read the right of the city within the framework and the features of this, the contemporary context, which is somehow different, with enormous challenges after, let us say, especially the neoliberal period and the neoliberal globalization process. But I think the issue of the right to the city is still relevant today, and this is still something that can help us to see how we can get back some of the things that we have lost in the past decades. Though I know this is a difficult process. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is, you were mentioning Stiglitz, and you were talking about this idea of in-betweenness, that we are, or it was more based on Gramsci than on Stiglitz, this idea of in-betweenness. And I think that we are now experiencing a period where several transitions are taking place, and that makes more difficult to assume something as a stable and concrete thing. It's not to go back to this old Marxist saying of all that is solid that melts in the air, because several of the things, as we've seen yesterday, are already non-solid. All the digital world is not exactly solid, so it melts even before it is. But I think that we are experiencing several transitions which make more difficult to position things and to understand them. The first transition is the economic one. Is this one, eventually neoliberalism is coming to an end. Actually, After Neoliberalism is also the title of a book by another author before. I don't know if it is Brenner that wrote this. Somebody wrote a book called After Neoliberalism. Now Stiglitz, in the paper that you have kindly distributed to us, talks about the end of neoliberalism, but we don't know what to put in its place. So we don't know what comes after. So we can say that we have an economic system in transition, or to use Ave's words, eventually, if there was an accumulation regime that we can call neoliberalism after the Fordist regime, we don't know exactly what is coming now. So this is the first slippery issue. But then there are three other transitions which I would like to talk about very briefly. The second one is a geopolitical transition that we often talk. It's the issue of Orientalization or Chinesization. The people who know about geopolitics discuss this. We receive this idea that the geographical center of the world is changing towards this. And often when we analyze politically what's coming to be, even in the text by Stiglitz, what we do see is political visions based in the Western thought. And eventually there is something on East also as a kind of global project for the world. It can be the presence of China in the world, or it can be something else, which is a vision of the East or some groups in cultural terms or political terms that also share a kind of vision for the entire world based on what they do in these parts of the world. I don't want to go much into detail on this, but just to call the attention that often we see, despite assuming that there is this transfer to East, we often assume that our vision of what will be the world in geopolitical terms is based on Western constructions, and eventually maybe something else. The third transition is more symbolic, and it's the urban one. And I want to, this morning I was in a session of another project conducted by a colleague about the urban voids, the urban empty spaces. And what is interesting on this is that urban empty spaces are also in-between spaces. And actually, they symbolically represent what was left by the period, let us say, previous to the crisis, so more neoliberal one, and what will be in the future. As my colleague Eduardo was saying, when he started the project 3 to 4 years ago, there were a lot of these empty spaces, and now the number of empty spaces is reduced, because several of them, then this is not his interpretation, are now going back into the capital circuits. But what is relevant on this is that these in-between spaces exist by themselves. It is not something that exists only because it was associated to the previous model and will be associated to the next model that is coming. The in-between produces something. And this is what makes things complex, because they are short, but actually they are relevant because they exist on the fact that this in-between creates something. And finally, the fourth transition is the easiest one, which is the easiest and the most complex to me, because it's the one which I don't dominate at all, which is the environmental one, the one associated to climatic changes. And this is very interesting, because when the climatic changes come into the table, and when the discussion about this arrives, a lot of people which apparently are politically supposedly neutral, with a lot of comas, came to the street demanding things. And so when we have ecological parties or para-ecological parties saying the environmental issues are not left or right-wing issues, they concern everybody, but like poverty concerns everybody, for instance, or other big issues. When they say this, they actually are wrong in the sense that environment is, as Melissa was saying, critically a political issue of this time. And it is interesting because probably through the climate issues, we can bring to the big demands groups of people which in other more traditional demands, which were associated to the 60s or 70s, the social ones, let us say, the big social ones, now don't respond. So these people don't respond to these social demands, but they are touched by the environmental issue and what will happen next. The second quick thing that I would like to talk about is the notion of rights. João was saying, now we have different layers of rights. That is true. But sometimes I think, and this is something that I would like to discuss, that when we think into the basic rights fights of the late 19th century and then the 20th century, things which are associated to class and demands of position in the economic structure, labor rights, etc., I still think that these are fundamental. And by fragmenting the rights issues, for instance, one said emancipatory rights, and then he said gender rights. Gender is part of the emancipatory rights, as race is part of the emancipatory rights. So when we fragment our fight, I don't know if we then lose something, because we have a lot of focus, and we become, in each of these focus, a smaller group. So the big demands, some way, are lost. I think that we should go back, or think in a way of combining these layers with some of the original fights, of course, and to change them into the contemporary situation of the big fights of the the big demands of the late 19th, 20th century. Because, as I was saying, inequality is increasing enormously. And this idea of 1% and 99% then crosses with the other inequalities. Because the 99% are often more black, more women, older than the 1%, which is often more white, more men, etc., etc. This is one of the issues. The other issue related to the rights is, who are the beneficiaries of the rights, for instance, in the city? The classical notion is the resident. Now, who is the resident of the city nowadays? When we discuss the resident according to the census principle, or to the electoral census principle, or in a society which is enormously mobile, and especially in the cities is enormously mobile, all the other persons that pass into the city from 3 days to 6 months or 4 years if they are students, what kind of rights they should have in the cities where they live, even for smaller periods. If this mobility is now much more frequent in nowadays societies. So this is a second issue, which is who actually is now, who should be the beneficiary of the right to the city principle. I would say that not just the resident, or that we should think in a different concept of resident.
Okay, so although this wasn't really planned, you actually gave me the perfect introduction for the next question, because the discussion of exactly not only what is a right, but who is entitled to that right and in which circumstances is fundamental. And this is very interesting if we look back at what Stiglitz says about what he considers the progressive left. He has now outlined a recipe for the emergence of a new political trend, a new political global project that he denominates the progressive left. And the progressive left is very interesting because it basically is a recipe that embodies what you were saying, which is revisiting structural rights, fundamental rights that we never ever sorted out in terms of social struggle, but it also brings to the fore an additional number of struggles, some of them Melissa has already highlighted, that are of an ecological nature. And the big issue is now, how are we going to redefine political spaces in terms of urban discussions, in terms of global discussions? So the notion of a political ecological space is something that we haven't really sought through, and I think it's probably going to be one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. So having given this dimension to the question, I give the word to you in terms of what kind of political ecological futures may emerge and exactly what kind of political mobilization can we witness already that might embody that kind of political space. We've seen children protesting in the name of their future in the streets. We are now seeing challenges, strong challenges to intergenerational solidarity. We're seeing big challenges in terms of what the globalization process has done in terms of environmental injustice worldwide. I mean, it is an extremely complex issue, and the notion is politics and political spaces as we know them are limited to give answers, are limited as debate arenas. What new political ecological spaces might emerge?
I'll take this one. Hello, is this on? Yeah. So this is interesting because when I was reflecting on this question, the first thing that came to mind was Extinction Rebellion. Have you been reading about this in the news? As something that I thought was really remarkable because climate change happens at such a large scale that people would immediately take this on as something, as an immediate direct action to go and occupy streets and demand action on climate change immediately. And I thought this was an interesting thing to bring up because, I also have a lot of questions about this movement, and there's some interesting points raised that get into this issue of difference in the city and who participates in these sorts and who is the right to the city for. Particularly, I don't know if you read about this, but the Extinction Rebellion wrote a prison guide because a lot of people would be arrested, right? And there were actually 1,000 people detained during those protests over 8 days in London, where they blocked a lot of the center of London. And the prison guide they put on the website said something like, you can practice yoga in prison, you can meditate, and there's time to take naps. And you can imagine people who have been imprisoned and know the reality of prison and who are not white, privileged people, they read this and went, I'm sure a long list of explicitives came out of their mouth. So I think there's also this question about who is attracted to participate, who can participate in these kind of actions. But I thought it was an interesting kind of direct action around climate change that I hadn't imagined would happen in that way, of people taking direct action, blocking streets to demand action on climate change. In terms of kind of a hopeful thing for me that brings these questions to the right to the city debate is climate justice mobilizations in the context of the United States. I was reading about the People's Climate March in 2017 in Washington, D.C., where there was people, for example, with the banners protesting evictions in Washington, D.C. that were saying housing justice is climate justice. And so I think this is what George was saying about bringing these demands together and showing that, I think this is the critical point, is how can we show that there are interconnections without separating. I have a bit of a different position in the sense I think it's really important to talk about class, but I think we also need to talk about difference. And there's this feeling that talking about gender and race dilutes the class dimension, but I think it's also important to recognize the intersectional identities, and that identities are multiple and different. And I think a lot of feminists call for this kind of vision, and then also talking about materialities and lived experience, so bringing this to people's lived experience. And I think, the political ecological view is that, of course, the environment is not separate from humans, but we're intimately interconnected. And I also always like this idea from David Harvey, this quote, "There's nothing unnatural about New York City." This idea that concrete is something unnatural. Well, it's something we've created as humans, and we're part of the environment too, and we create and shape our environments as well. The environment is not something out there, but it's here with us. And of course, this is conceptually really interesting, but in practice, it's tricky. And in terms of this issue of lived experience and materialities, which I think is really important for this definition of the future right to the city, and what kind of politics can come from that. In the housing movement, where I've been very engaged in Barcelona and the platform for mortgage-affected people, we had a lot of debates a few years ago about squatting bank-owned properties or properties owned by real estate developers as a strategy to claim the right to the city. And this was things we discussed in assemblies about, well, we're being forced to live in the periphery. All the interests, real estate interests and banks are occupying these foreclosed homes or new developments that went bankrupt and turning them into middle-class, upper-class housing. So if we occupy these spaces and use them as homes, as lived spaces which people need, for their daily reproduction, that this is a way to make the right to the city that's enacting the rights. And I think this it's like a Ranserian, very political act. Like, this is a political act of disrupting the established order, and instead of thinking about asking rights from someone, we're enacting them ourselves. So I think for me, this issue of the kind of politics that can spring or force the definition of the future right to the city, building on issues that directly affect people. So if we can connect, I think, again, this idea of housing justice is climate justice. If we can bring these and make them more tangible for people, because I think for many people, the environment it's a privilege to act on issues of environment when you can't pay your rent or you can't, fulfill your basic necessities, even though we know they're fundamentally interconnected. And I think, for example, the social movement has been so successful because it's directly working with an issue that people are about to lose their home, they're about to be evicted. So people come to assemblies because they're directly affected by these issues. So I think finding a way to connect to this lived experience is really critical. And this political struggle is rooted in the experience of the home, the city, the neighborhood, because people also, their children go to local schools. So I think trying to build on this is really critical. And in closing, I think in some ways I'm very pessimistic about the definition of the future right to the city, that it will be forced on us because of drastic change that will make political organizing a necessity because of extreme weather events, because of all sorts of things that look like they will happen in the future, and because now we have such short-term thinking that we can't, organize around that immediately. And I think finally we can't forget to think about the rise of the far right that's happening across Europe, across the world, and how this is really dangerous and concerning in propagating fear of the others and in propagating an exclusionary city, which is a lot of these movements are imagining the city only for, white people, native people. So I think we need to be thinking about this as well when we're talking about the future politics and political mobilizations that are coming up and how this is affecting future definitions of right to the city.
Ready?
Yes.
Eric. Yes. So,
okay. A remark first. Maybe there is here an issue of age, and I always have some difficulty in leading with this idea of doomsday or the times of the end. Because I think from time to time in the history of humankind, there is this idea that we are very close to the disaster. Maybe we are now more closer to the disaster than in the 1970s. But I remember that when I was in 1970, there was this stickers with the sun saying, nuclear no thanks. And then there was this version which is nukes no thanks, because we're very much into this idea that an enormous nuclear war could take place between, Soviet Union and its allies, and United States and NATO and its allies. So there was very much also this idea when I was young in the 70s. So I believe very much in the capacity of regenerating. So I think that we are, that there is this clock which says that we are 1 minute or 2 minutes close to the world crisis or something, that some organization in the world runs. I'm sure that Peter Magillian knows where they have this clock, and we saw it in television from time to time. But I think this 2 minutes will last for quite a long time. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything, because if we don't do anything, the fact is that yes, we can pass the 2 minutes. So I think all the issues of claiming, fighting, coming to the street, complaining, and trying to change what sometimes seems to be the negative order of things have to be fought and challenged. If we don't do anything, yes, the doomsday can arrive. So we have to do things. What I believe is that in our capacity of changing, I think we become first virtual beings, then the world will come to an end. I mean, that this our physical existence combined, really, it's not science fiction. It's really what I think. I think in 5 generations, our material world and the material world will combine in the next generations. This is really what I think. Now, having said this, the issue of combining basic social demands and the basic social rights and all issues related, for instance, with environment. I think there are two elements that, for me, in conceptual perspective, are relevant. One is risk susceptibility, a little bit in the sense of Beck, but also in the more pragmatical issue of risk as it is dealt with by my colleagues at the Institute of Geography. Because I think, as has been mentioned by Melissa, the susceptibility to the risk incorporates 2 things. One, it is unfair in the sense that those who are in more favorable social positions can handle much better with environmental and mixed risk. To talk about these two and set aside the human risk. And secondly, because as João was saying, it urges to do things. The exposure to risk is higher, so we have to do things more fast, because something can happen very soon. So I think that risk is one of the key issues of nowadays society. I think that even Beck said that in the past, inequalities was associated to class, now it's associated to the degree of exposure to risk. He doesn't say it exactly by these words, but I think he more or less meant it in one of his texts. And this is connected with something that was also mentioned here, and which I think it brings back the right to place, not necessarily the right to the city, but right to place, the right to be in the city, or to be in the region, which is the issue of evictions or expulsions, as discussed, for instance, by Saskia Sassen, or for the American urban world by Matthew Desmond, which is, as it has been said here, more and more we find people being expelled from the places where they are for a variety of reasons. Urban speculation being the one which is discussed about Lisbon, but environmental change being an enormous one due to the enlargement of the areas which are becoming more deserted, for instance, in North Africa, in Sahel, for instance, or in the southern part of Africa. Estimates talk about millions having to move from their places because the resources are disappearing. And then we have the more immediate catastrophes that make people immediately move to somewhere else. So I think the issue of expulsions that joins human issues, or economic issues if you want, and environmental issues, that joins people being expelled in the urban world from the city centers, as it has been mentioned here, but also from several areas of Africa where grab landing processes are taking place, when, for instance, agriculture of subsistence, or which is necessary for the farmers, is replaced by agriculture which serves the interests of big corporations with the large extensions of soya or other products which are necessary both to feed us all, but also to industries that need this kind of products. So I think the issue of expulsions and the right to be in certain places and the issue of risk are fundamental in uniting the fights and the demands, joining the environmental and the social. And in a very pragmatical way, I think that how can we operationalize, let us say, these fights? First, there is a clear issue. How can we combine representative democracy with participative democracy, or participatory? I don't know what is the exact term in English. So I think this combination is key in nowadays society, because what happens often is, okay, street is absolutely relevant, but at the end of the day, representative democracy assumes the final decisions. And so how can we make participative democracy more effective in terms of having an impact in the process of changes that is higher than the impact that it already has? The second issue is for us, the academia. Okay, we try to open more and more. I've seen the papers outside. I've been into ICS more than once in events where there is this open door. There is the entire example of the work in Marvilla that is in the other room there. But I think we are still in a relatively limited level of an open academia. And one of the reasons why we are on this limited level, of course, there's one which is time. Due to the way our scientific work is organized, we don't have much time. But also, the other issue is how we evaluate the outreach activities and the non-classical, let us say, academic outputs. And I think there is a long path to run in terms of this way of valuing outreach activities outside the academia and making what we do here available for the others and incorporating what the others do outside, let us say communities, etc., in our nowadays activity or everyday activity.
Okay. I don't think we have the same notion of the proportion of the doomsday. Yes, there are cyclical doomsdays in history. I'm not really sure we see eye to eye on the nature and characteristics of the current doomsday, but fair enough. So the idea now, and Melissa said it quite well, the rise of far-right nationalism, but not only. There is a rise of populist politics and post-truth and alternative truth, and we as scientists are facing the biggest enemy ever, because the value of what we do and how we do it is simply under attack. And if we think about our role, if we think about the current political context, and if we dare to think after neoliberalism, let's focus on the issue of hope. Hope is one of the big words in the title of the conference, and we decided to dedicate the final discussion on the issue of hope. And we couldn't really see eye to eye on what hope means, so I'm going to basically outline a definition of hope. It's Václav Havel's definition of hope. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that it makes sense. So we don't really know the outcome of our actions, but at least we are conscious that we are doing the right thing for the right reason, and that is the discussion here. So how can the right to the city, be either a trigger or a host for a discussion at the urban level for a future with hope?
In some ways, I feel that it's useful to just dismiss the notion of rights. Maybe this is another good polemic thing to say as a debate, in the spirit of debate, to maybe just not talk about rights at all, because rights are actually really, really problematic. A lot of political theorists and people have written about this. I really like Don Mitchell's work. He has a great book, The Right to the City, Social Justice, and the Fight for Public Space. It's quite, it's from 2003, it's a very good book, and he talks about, rights talk, when we use this language of rights, that it's very problematic, because they're not universal and abstract, but products of specific social and political moments. Rights are indeterminate because the language can be used by both sides, to use it to their advantage. They're often reified, so they devalue real and complex experience. They make it quite simple. If we talk about a right as something, when in reality it's much more complex. And he argues they're politically unuseful because rights often protect privilege and domination, people who are privileged and dominate the situation instead of the oppressed and minorities. And I mean, I think it's also very important to say that Lefebvre never meant the idea of rights literally. But that's the way, as João noted, it's often been interpreted in circles, in urban forums and the United Nations, and all these people have taken this idea of right to the city in a literal way of talking about rights. And I think the spirit that Lefebvre used it of understanding rights as a tool of the ruling class to maintain the status quo, and that the usefulness of rights is in transgressing them and transcending them and in uncovering inequalities through them, is more, the kind of value I think it has. And I mean, again, going back to what I was talking about in the other point of debate about squatting abandoned buildings that are under process of speculation in cities as a way to claim the right to the city and the right to live in the center and in central parts of the city. And I think for me, this is more of the kind of way that I think that gives me hope. The way that organized movements do this and use this discourse of saying, we need housing, we need to be in the city, and this is a strategy we use to enact that. And so in Madrid, for example, one of the mottos that they used was take and do, don't ask and wait. So this was what they would, the kind of way they expressed squatting as a political activity and as a space of generating this new kind of thinking. And I wonder if it's useful for us to, instead of talking about right to the city, to talk about commons. If we talk about commons a lot, it's a new way. I mean, for me, Barcelona and Comú, the way that this idea of the Comú, the common, has been used in Barcelona's. I mean, again, I think it's a new idea that I think has a lot of, in terms of the social imaginary and what the commons brings, has a lot of potential, but it also, of course, has the possibility to be co-opted and used another way. But in terms of hope, I think it has interesting and brings some creative possibilities to think, particularly if we think about commoning as a process and thinking about material commons, about social commons, so about the material and the immaterial and the way that we can build on this. And I think, when we think about commoning, about appropriating spaces of power and counteracting this process of capitalist urbanization, in terms of also hope related to commoning, for me, I think about examples, like practical examples on the ground and projects that are taking place that we can help us rethink the right to the city and how we think about hope in the future. There's a project in Barcelona called Can Batlló, which is an old, I don't know if anyone's heard of it, it's an old factory in Sants, in a working class district in Barcelona. And this, was supposed to be a green space. It's an old industrial space. It's very large, it's about 50 hectares. And the local community squatted the spaces and asked and demanded the city turn this into space for community activities. And they've won this struggle. It hasn't turned into community property, but the community is running. And it's a very intersectional space, which I think is really fundamental about this, as I raised before. It's really open to all sorts of people, and they explicitly talk about being open to all types of people who want to participate in these spaces. So I think, again, this lived experience and recognizing the difference is really critical. And the last point I wanted to talk about, I think the language we use is really important when we're talking about reframing the right to the city and thinking of hope. There's talk about the Anthropocene, which is we're in this era of where humans are impacting the climate. And I think Jason Moore has talked very, this kind of language is more important, talking about the capitalocene. It's actually capital. It's not humans. It's not all of us humans who are creating these problems, who have created this system that we live in that is so extremely complex to change because of the structures that we live in, but it's a process of capital and speculation and profit making that's created this. So I think this kind of language of using terms like capitalocene instead of Anthropocene, which, suggests that we're all responsible, but saying actually no, there's the 1%, there's a portion that is responsible for what's happening. I think that's quite important as well.
Okay, George.
Okay.
Your recipe for hope.
That I haven't had recipe for hope, sorry. But I think this issue of responsibility is relevant, because I do think that we are all responsible. The question is, we are not all responsible in the same degree. Ones are much more responsible than the others. And this idea that we are all responsible, on one hand, it shows that we all have to act because we are responsible. But this idea that we are not responsible in the same degree is that some people have more responsibility than the others, and they should be pushed in order to participate more in the process of change, even if they don't want to do it, or if they do it in the wrong way. I think this is one issue. Then, in terms of what is hope? First, how can we try to create a space for hope? And I think some of the issues that Melissa addressed are important. I think some others can also be assumed as absolutely relevant. One of them is, for instance, this idea that economic growth and monopolies or big international corporations are always associated and are the recipe for success. We have heard yesterday something about this idea that one of the ideas of the goals of Uber is to control some kind of mobilities in cities. So to have the monopoly of these mobilities in cities. It can lose now to gain after. This was the idea. And I think you have to break this idea that the only way to reach success is through an enormous economic growth, and that only can be achieved with big corporations or big international corporations. So in many cases, the issue of scale is important, but we also have to demonstrate that smaller scale can bring social effectiveness and gains, and eventually not necessarily a zero growth, as some economists propose, but a more limited growth with better redistribution and with an higher social impact. I think there are several experiences that involve cooperative processes, this return to commons, for instance, this idea that we have to respect what communities do, changes. Yesterday we were talking about the energy process, so breaking the monopolies in terms of fundamental resources for everybody, water, electricity, waste disposal. I think that we have to demonstrate that it's possible to organize this at a level which doesn't have to be the international one, although I think the international interchange on issues is absolutely fundamental. So this is one thing, to break this idea of the growth of economic growth and monopolies and international corporations. The second issue is probably technology. I always say that technology is fundamental. I think it is a pillar of transformation because it makes us think in another way. We see societies in a different way due to technology. It's not something that makes our life easier. It makes our life different. But technology doesn't exist by itself. It is something that is only useful if people can access to it. I always use the same example of around the beginning of the 16th century. So typography was fundamental because it made the things that were written accessible to everybody. It was, instead of copying books by hand, it was possible to reproduce them easily by hundreds or thousands. Now, is this the real revolution? Probably not. The big revolution came when we changed in Europe the fact that we had 5 or 10% of population that were able to read to 90% that were able to read. It doesn't matter if we have thousands of books if nobody can read them. So to make technology accessible and to make it an element of the transformation process is here a key issue. Probably more important than to advance technology in itself. So this is the second element which I believe will help us to bring hope. The third issue is, now answering to something that you were talking about before, fighting, let us say, right-wing populism. And this is hard to do because we have to show to people that have been depossessed in the last decades that the alternative to regain power is not through this idea of populism, is not through this idea that the others, a third party, is always responsible, or that is impossible to fight, for instance, the big corporations that dispossess people. But I think that this discourse against the populism is fundamental, and it should be a discourse with demonstration. And probably demonstration goes back to this idea, to the small urban initiatives in which people show that a garden can be set in a certain place where a building was expected to be built. Or in another place where a building was squatted and people who didn't have a house can have. Or that a project in India for those who cannot afford for a home and find through a cooperative system a possibility of being housed paying $2 or $3 per month. So it's through this small, very much through these small initiatives that probably we can, and showing them and insist on them, that, and internationalizing, globalizing these initiatives, that we can help to show to people that there are alternatives to this easy discourse of populism, because it's a very, very easy discourse. It is very, you know, it attracts very much to people. Right-wing populism, because there is a left-wing populism, right-wing populism is very attractive, because you really say to people what they want to listen, and you try to convince them that that is going to happen. It won't. But you say, no, we are going to give, we are going to create jobs, and we will prevent international competition because we will impose very high taxes, or we will protect only our national enterprises, etc., etc. But then you don't break or you don't attack strongly, for instance, the center of the capital in the country where this is taking place. There was an old, and I'll shut up immediately after this, there was a saying in the past which was very, in the 60s and 70s, a song which was written by Chris Christopherson, and then it was Janis Joplin that made it popular. And there was this saying, it was me and Bobby McKee. And the song had this saying which was, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. But nothing ain't nothing, but it's free. Now the question is, we can't stop here, because we must have something. It cannot be nothing. It must be freedom and something.
Okay, thank you, George. So the recipe for hope involves freedom and something. And something. Okay, so the debate for something keeps on being something that we can deal with. Now, we're going to take a few questions from the audience. Whoever wants to start, and after a few questions, Pedro is going to do a wrap-up comment. Okay, there in the back, Simon here. Is it you yourself? That gentleman over there. You.
So, Luís Mendes from IGOT, thank you so much for this amazing session. Very briefly, I disagree partly with what Melissa said about squatting. I think I'm involved as geographer in activism for some years now in the movement ICS-ULisboa, which is very close to PA. And one of the things that I learned through my research action process on my PhD also is that urban social movements, they are successful when they are strong with participatory democracy, but are strongly engaged in the institutions of representative democracy. If this engagement doesn't happen, there's no success in terms of conquering some rights or taking back the rights that were ours and are not anymore. So I believe in that. You know, I think that's a condition to urban change in the sense not of urban regeneration, but in terms of urban reform. So my question is, what's the feeling of the presenters on the role that urban social movements have in this process of urban reform?
Shall we take two questions and then it's easier? So there's Simon and then there's this colleague there. Yes.
Thanks, Melissa and George. It was very inspiring. Well, I will disagree with the disagreement, because I believe the social movements, I mean, with my involvement in Ambita, that has been supporting families that have squatted, not the squatting itself, but people that had already squatted, been supported by Ambita, that only through confrontational actions has some advancement being achieved in Portugal, because in representative democracy, what is going on in politics and in policies is basically useless policies that are not solving any of the real issues of the housing crisis in Portugal, but small victories have been achieved by confrontational actions of various types. But apart from that, we're going to keep talking about that. Yeah, I'm very inspired by Melissa's suggestion on the issue of scale, but in part of the also George's. And I mean, like, going back to the right to the city, you might be thinking that, you know, the problem with right to the city is both words are wrong. Because right seems to imply that it's something given. And then what we've learned after neoliberalism is that nothing is given. That we have to fight for everything. So from right, I will go to fight. And even more on an age of possible environmental disaster, which is science telling us, not God now, George, so it's a bit more realistic than, it's about fighting for those things, not expecting that someone is going to give anything. And then city, well, I mean, on this I'm with Brenner. I mean, the city is a pointless concept nowadays, to simplify it, because the point is how we are all involved in this huge process of transformation. The oikos, would say Jason Moore, who Melissa mentioned. So, I mean, maybe from the right to the city, we have to go to fight for the planet. And I don't see no hope at the local scale, sincerely. Either we are able to actually engage at the global level, or well, we are doomed. Some of us will resist in hyper-ventilated places on top of hills, etc., and the others, who knows?
Hello, thank you for the amazing talk so far. I think we should have a little restraint and a bit of caution when using the term white privilege. There are indeed some issues, we cannot deny it. There are several types of issues. There are individuals that have clear job advantages just because they know someone. These are cases that should be investigated and dealt with to prevent incompetence and corruption. Also, there are cases of people of one race benefiting people of the same race, and that happens in any race. But also, they should also be dealt with individually as a law process. But there are also some white people, or people of any race, that have clear advantages, but because their parents had built a better life, be that because of luck or effort, but they just have better tools because of the parents they have. They have access to better education, they have access to universities even though they don't have a decent grade average. But when you use the term white privilege, we put all of these people in the same basket, and that's leading to a bit of separation between people. So I think, in my opinion, the solution is evaluating each of these injustices, the ones that I mentioned at the start, with the jobs and the favoritisms, but dealing them in a judicial, in a law manner.
Okay, these are three very different questions with one dissent from the first comment, so this is not going to be easy. I think you're going to touch on some issues between rights and fights. You know, the UN Charter of Human Fights is going to be a different one. And then you have, I think, a question on meritocracy, or a degree of meritocracy, which was your point.
The issue with generalization.
There you go. So it's interesting because it's kind of an outlier here in the conversation, but something good for you to explore. Melissa, shall you go first?
Yeah, thank you for the questions and for the food for thought to debate. So I think your question about the engagement with participatory democracy and what's the role of urban social movements and urban reform. I mean, I think what's interesting with the PA, the mortgage-affected platform in Spain that's been so successful, is that they have this dual strategy where they demand rights. They'd say, okay, the Spanish Constitution has the right to housing, so we demand the right to housing, and they do these kind of, it's happened multiple times, popular legislative initiative, where they gather signatures to present a new proposal in Congress. The first one was in 2013, and 1.5 million signatures were gathered, which was 3 times the amount that's necessary to change the mortgage law, to change the Spanish mortgage law. So this kind of strategy takes place at the same time that the direct action takes place. At the same time, what's very interesting is that within the movement, because there's 240 nodes all over Spain, and in Catalonia, the PA is quite strong because it's born in Barcelona, there's a lot of different views on the role of rights and how effective this is, because a lot of energy is spent doing this kind of rights work. And there's been so many levels. It's taken at the national level. There's been 2 attempts to try to change the law. In the end, it never even gets debated in Congress. At the level of the autonomous community, there's also been attempts to change laws in Catalonia to address energy poverty and evictions. Also in Sevilla, in Andalusia, to appropriate bank-owned properties. What happens is that the Spanish legal system declares these unconstitutional in the end. So there's all this work that goes into building this, which on the one hand, I think the validity in it is showing kind of ordinary people that you're also trying to use tools that exist to change this status quo. But at the same time, in terms of providing solutions, it's not providing any solutions. It's not actually... and this is something that's debated a lot in the movement, and like in Sabadell, which is a working class city outside of Barcelona where I spent a lot of time, the PA there is very explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and they do a lot of work. Their focus is we're just going to squat buildings because we have so many people that don't have a place to live. They can't pay their rent, their mortgage. They need a place to live immediately. But at the same time, because they're framed in the larger movement, they benefit from the work that the movement does around kind of pushing for kind of more democratic tools, within the system to change. So I think the PA is an interesting case because it does use these kind of existing tools, but at the same time uses direct action. But going into Simon's point, I agree personally that in the end of the day, I think in terms of providing a real solution immediately, the best way is squatting, especially because in Spain there's so many empty properties that are owned by banks that are foreclosed. The people couldn't pay the mortgage, the bank reclaimed the home, or they were built during a time of the economic boom and there was a lot of speculation and they're unfinished housing. So I think this has been the way to really, because the emergency housing lists, the waiting lists are so long. People are waiting for 2 years to get a place to live. They're living in residences and terrible accommodation, which is not a home. So this is how I feel about it as well. I'd share that point. Just quickly on Simon's point, I think this is interesting, this idea of no rights and no city. So how do we address this? It made me think in Germany, there was some interesting direct action at energy sites, like sites that produce mine resources, going and occupying these sites. Which again, this is, I think, an interesting idea, but I think the scale question is really difficult. How do you bring this global issue to a local place, and knowing that your action is kind of diffused within these structural dynamics that are so impossible to change, like all the energy companies that control, what's going on with the climate, and who are not interested in changing, unless, so I think this is a point. In terms of the final question quickly about white privilege, I would recommend, this is literature that I'm new with, but in Black Studies literature, there's a lot of work coming out around this. And I think for me what's important is as a white person to recognize white privilege, the fact that being a white person has automatically brought privilege because we live in a colonial, we don't live in a post-colonial society. There's still colonial relationships present that operate in different forms. But I think for me the issue is recognizing the privilege and accepting that I don't think it's not about blaming, but it's about recognizing that it exists. And for me, I don't know, when I read about it, I recognize, yes, I'm privileged because I'm a white person. Okay, I have different, because I'm a woman, I face different challenges than men do. But I think this is where intersectionality comes into place and is important. So I would disagree with your point, but I would also advise reading about white privilege, because I think it's an important issue to be aware of as a white person.
Okay, starting with this last one, with what you were saying, I think that there are 2 levels. One is more structural, and at the structural level, I think we should assume that there are privileges which are associated to some groups. And yes, eventually even more than Melissa. I'm white, I'm man, I'm 50. So all this in terms of group, in principle, bring me advantages which I'm aware of. And I think we should have conscious of this and know that the society is built along all these lines, and I agree with intersectionality. I pushed a little bit into the basic rights as they were developed some time ago before we started with all these other fracturant issues, as somebody said, wrongly. But I think we should be aware of disadvantages. The other thing is when we are analyzing specific cases, because the specific situations of people within particular contexts show that sometimes what can be considered an advantage doesn't exist. And then we have to compare this with other issues, which is also going back to the issue of class. It's not just male, 50, white. It's also middle class. So if I was low middle class, the things would be different. If I was a woman, the things would be different. And I think we must have conscious of this and also be aware of something else. It's very hard for somebody that has privileges to abdicate from these privileges. This is a very hard thing. And the first step is to be conscious of them. And that makes us understand why the others see that, or they plead and ask for the privileges that we have. And I think this is a very important step. So I think we should distinguish between the structural level and then the specific circumstances of the cases that we analyze or where we are placed. The second issue, well, some of the things have already been said by Melissa. I don't know. I think I agree with Simon when he says, well, locally we don't go anywhere. Yeah, probably we don't. But so we have to combine, it's the old story, the top-down issue and the bottom-up issue in terms of the claims that we make and the fights that we do. And I don't know, I think in each circumstance we operate in a different way. But I think this, I don't believe in a society completely fragmented where there is no transnational contact. I think this is absurd in nowadays, and more than that, we lose if we stuck to a very local perspective. Actually, localism can even, at a certain point, be a negative thing. Final element, the city. I wouldn't say that the city doesn't exist, because I still think that the city as, let us say, an abstract entity, but also something that we also know more or less as it is, right? We have a definition of city, there are specific ones. I still think that city is probably one, if not the most interesting social realization of humankind. And having said this, that's why we are all here. We are in the city. And okay, capitalism with its need to increase capital rotation benefits from concentration, and that contributes to the growth of cities. We are all conscious of this. We all know that. But actually the city precedes capitalism. So I think that the urban world is a very interesting world. And it's astonishing in many things. The places where we have created cities, how people live in cities, how the cities are, even this old medieval German saying, which is the air of the city brings liberty, is something, because to live outside the city was worse, right? It was much worse in terms of the relationship with the landlord, the aristocrat that was the owner of the land and of the people that actually were living there. They were not slaves, but the Serbs were close to slaves in many things. So I think that the city has an enormous potential. The question is how we can make livable cities. That's for me, the issue. And that is hard. Livable in terms of justice, in terms of quality, in terms of access, etc.
Okay. So as a white male, privileged, but so that privileges do matter at the small scale in terms of labor rights, or as Simone would say, labor fights. This is a tenure-track researcher. The majority of the people around my age, 44 and below, around here, have no hope of a tenure track. So privilege, when you look at it has really, really a lot of layers. So that's an interesting point. So I notice now that you're 50, so 6 years of difference between tenure and non-tenure. Hope and not hope. But on that point, no, on that point,
I got
we
tenure when I was 30, and that is completely unfair.
there you go. So about that's a good point. But we're moving into Pedro's space because he patiently waited for like an hour. And Pedro, the next 20 minutes before the coffee breaks are yours. This is your moment to wrap up, and you can. This is the space. The floor is yours. Please have a go.
Thank you. So Peter Magellan,
Yes.
white and still 49, so no, it's not as bad. Okay. So thank you for inviting me. I was asked to do two things. The first thing is to do this magnificent wrap-up, summarizing and highlighting everything that Melissa and George have said. And I'm going to pretend I didn't hear this request, because it's impossible for me. It's not really my field. Some of the things touch on, of course, things that interest me deeply, but that's not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do, it's slightly different, is to try, and this is the second thing that was asked of me, to try and answer the questions on the original brief from my own perspective, and hopefully touch on some of the issues that were raised. So the brief, basically, the way I read it was, how did I react to the consequences of anthropocenic global urbanization, the coexistence between environmental, social, and spatial justice, and most importantly, the kind of politics that springs from those challenges. So this is what I want to talk about. So I'm an empirical political scientist. I, as was said, study elections and public opinion, and empirical political scientists are very bad at answering these sorts of questions. We are really good at being retrospective. We are terrible at being prospective. We are, I think, quite good at trying to describe and explain how things are, not so good as describing how are they likely to be, and even worse at discussing how they should be. So this is a very, very difficult challenge for me. And I want to give, so we have a kind of a status quo bias, even if it is to say that the status quo is horrible, but that's the kind of thing that we focus on. I want to give an example of this. I was thinking, so João talked about this kind of democracy literature. I want to read you a couple of titles of a bunch of recent books, and there are many more. Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. It's a pretty good book. And the best of them, actually, How Democracies Die. All these books have to do with things that are happening now in places like the US, in places like Hungary, in places like Poland, and the threats that these books describe, all of them written by empirical political scientists, are the old threats. They may have the support of new technologies, they may have the support of new means of mobility, but they are the old threats. The threats are authoritarianism and illiberalism, right? But the question that is raised is a different question. It's not about the old threats. It's about something else. It's about the way I see it, how these challenges, anthropocenic global urbanization, environmental change, challenge democracy on its own terms. In a sense, raise this, I think, much more, not that I think that what's happening in Hungary is very disturbing, but this is an even more disturbing possibility, which is the possibility that liberal democracy is a project that is unable to deal with the kind of modern social, ecological challenges. And I think that this is the really, really difficult question that empirical political scientists try not to think about. Political theorists do think a lot about this. And I was, in a sense, I see this as a challenge to talk about this. So why is democracy or liberal democracy potentially unable, really unable to deal with these challenges? Before I say this, I want to say that I think liberal democracy is a wonderful thing. Okay, it's a great invention. I will actually qualify that. It's not really an invention, and I'm going to talk about this in the end. We tend to forget, but it's a product of struggle. It's a product of a long historical process that in some cases involved massive destruction, millions of dead people, a civil war in the US, and even that didn't solve everything, the Glorious Revolution in the UK, very, very difficult processes, but processes that in the end ended up with a compromise, some sort of compromise. And it's a great compromise. It's a compromise that allows equal participation. And of course, I know that that equality happens in that small moment where we get into the voting booth. I always tell this to my children, that there are many, many problems in the world, many asymmetries of power, many problems of inclusion, but there's a single moment where whatever you do, not yet you, my children, whatever I do, has the same value as everybody else. So this is something that we should treasure. It allows, liberal democracy limits power. It prevents particular interests of a group of people, or it makes it more difficult than any other regime from getting an hegemony over society, from preserving indefinitely their domination. And it promotes the accountability of rulers before people. This is what regular elections do. But the problems emerge in light of our challenge. When we think about accountability before whom? That's why I think the problems start. And they start in three ways. You talked about residents, right? Democracy is about residents. It's about the people who are there, right? Sometimes it's even narrower than that. It's about the people who are there and the people that I recognize as being part of my political community. These are the people who vote in an election. But the challenge that we have, of course, is that everything that politicians decide on the basis of that political process affects everybody outside that political community. Right? This is the typical problem that we have when you think about environmental policies. There are externalities. This problem goes from neighborhood to city, from city to region, from region to country, from country to continent. Every time a particular political unit makes a decision, that decision, from the point of view that we've been discussing, affects everybody else, or a lot of people outside it. But those people outside it, they don't vote in our election. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem. Of course, you can think about coordination mechanisms. A lot of coordination mechanisms exist. You can have coordination mechanisms between municipalities. But in the end, the mayor of Lisbon is elected by the people of Lisbon. The people of Amadora and the people of Loures and the people of Odivelas do not vote for the mayor of Lisbon. So democracy promotes, and rightly so in a way, but it promotes this sort of accountability that does not solve the nature of the problems that we face. Problems where local decisions have regional consequences, as regional decisions have national consequences, national decisions have consequences that transcend borders. Democracy is not very well equipped to deal with this problem. The second problem is, and I'm not going to take a long time to talk about it, it's very familiar to you, is that the people who vote are existing citizens. They are not future citizens. The unborn do not vote. But everything we do affects them. And of course, you can put in constitutions language about intergenerational justice, but as Melissa said, this is papel mojado, right? They do not vote. And if they don't vote, politicians don't care about them. In the end, they may care about them, but all the incentives go against it. All the incentives go against it. This is a second major problem. And the third problem, which, as I'm going to describe it, sounds like an incredible virtue of democracy, but think about it for a second, is that democracies make politicians accountable in terms of whatever citizens define are their preferences and their interests. The problem, of course, is that some of those preferences and some of those interests are very myopic. People care about living well, about more welfare, more money, better conditions for them and their family. Politicians know this. And what politicians do is that whenever you get close to an election, and remember, regular elections are a great thing, but what they also promote is myopic policies for myopic voters. And how do we get out of this? There's a bias in democracies in favor of the short term against the long term. And it's really hard to get out of this. I have some ideas about this. I've done some research about this. This is kind of the only issue where I think that my research touches on things that may be of direct relevance for this conference. But the bias is there, and it's very, very strong. So I'm very worried about the ability of liberal democracy to deal with the kind of challenges that we've been talking about in this conference. But I'm even more worried about the alternative answers. What are the alternative answers? At least the two, if we exclude, going back to the past, thinking about what seems the alternatives that are configuring themselves in the present to liberal democracy. One is, I'm going to use a kind of a fancy word, epistocracy. Right? This is the title of a very interesting book by a political theorist called Jason Brennan, Epistocracy, the rule of the people who know. Right? These are the people who know. These are not the ignorant, myopic citizens. These are people who know. They know about climate change. They know about urban policies. They know about all these things. Let them decide. We can make it this even narrower. Technocracy, the rule of experts. I mean, this is not just about only allowing the people who know to vote. We don't even need to vote. Right? We can allow experts to decide. This is a very tempting answer to the problems I've described before. Right? Think about voters, short-term, narrow, myopic interests. Let's get rid of it. Let the people who know decide. Decision-making gets insulated from all those nasty pressures. And the other thing which is wonderful, we talked about this, the narrowness of the political community that makes decisions, the difficulty in coordinating between different jurisdictions. Experts are great at that. They speak the language of truth. They speak the language of science. We can articulate a global response to these problems by means of experts. So why is this a problem? I think it's a problem first just on the basis of outcomes. I'm not even thinking before in terms of legitimacy. All of you, I mean, a lot of people here know better than I do that, for example, on climate change, there is a consensus on the fundamentals. But policies are not about fundamentals. They're about details. And there's no consensus on the details. Right? The policies and their consequences and their feedback loops and their interactions are so complex that you can't believe that a room full of experts would produce the perfect policies. So even in terms of outcomes, there's a problem. But there's even a worse problem. Epistocratic arguments have been used throughout history with a very clear goal, to justify domination. Justify domination of man by women, poor by rich, educated by uneducated.
White, black by white.
Black by white, you can go through the whole list. And it's not just the history, it's the present. Somebody mentioned here yesterday something that I didn't know, and I went and checked. And it's true. So 8 out of China's top 9 government officials are scientists and engineers. It's perfect, right? It's the perfect epistocracy. Do you want to be China? I mean, what I fear is that more and more people, even in our societies, they want to be China. And this is something that we need to think about. What is the other major alternative? It has been discussed before by both of you. It's populism. Democracy, yes, let's get rid of the liberal part of it. That's too complicated. Let's make people decide. The people versus the elites, even those experts and the knowledgeable. And populism is also very tempting as a solution for the problems of liberal democracy. One of the problems is institutions, rules, bureaucratic hurdles, all this paralysis to the challenges that, climate change and all these problems are bringing. Let's get rid of it. Let's make the people overcome all these institutional hurdles. Another problem, established interests that capture the state. Let the people decide. Let the people trump. It's not a pun. It could be. These interests. But in practice, what do we know? Remember when I talked about one of the problems, I think it's a problem of liberal democracies, the way free and fair elections are organized, the narrowness of the definition of political community. Is populism providing a broader definition of political community? It's always the opposite. Immigrants are not real citizens. They shouldn't decide anything. All definitions of political community that populism defines, it's always a narrower, even narrower definition than what liberal democracy provides. Forget about the future. Forget about non-citizens. Forget about non-residents. Forget about future citizens. We want decisions now by the people. Is this conducive to long-term sustainable policies? I don't think so. And notice, epistocracy legitimizes itself on the basis of outcomes, right? We can provide you the right answer. Populists in many places, they don't care about the outcome. The only outcome they care about is if we have a referendum and something different from what the government wants comes out. That's the outcome they care about. The content of the policy sometimes doesn't matter. Go around the policies of populist parties in Europe. What do they have to say about climate change? Well, nothing. They don't care. Right? So populism is not an answer. So what is the answer? I don't have the answer. Okay, so I'm sorry. I don't have the answer. There are problems with liberal democracy, big problems with epistocracy, big problems with populism. I just want to go back to something I said before, which is to say, the answer that we got for a while and seemed to solve at least some of our problems came out of struggle and compromise. And this next, hopefully adequate solution will come out of compromise, but before, there has to be struggle. It's inevitable. The kind of struggles that we've been describing here at the urban level, all these sorts of... I'm not even saying that these different movements, what they want is actually the best for the common interest. I don't know if that's true. But this struggle is necessary for some good compromise to come out. And that's the only answer I can provide for the future. Thanks.
Okay, so now we wrap up this first half of the day. And there's a quick coffee break on the other side of the corridor, and we'll be back at 6 to listen to the speech by Vanessa Broto. Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon to you all. It is my pleasure to be here today to introduce Professor Vanessa Castanbroto. No? It's okay? It is working. So, okay. Professor Vanessa Castanbroto is currently leading the Climate Urbanism Group at the Urban Institute in the University of Sheffield. And her research focuses on the governance of global environmental change in the urbanization age. She is a lead chapter author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and previously she led a chapter in the World Cities Report of the UN Habitat. In 2016, she received the Philip Leverhulme Prize. Her last book was published this year in Cambridge University Press and is called Urban Energy Landscapes. Our talk today will be on messy practices in the urban politics of climate change. So I'll give the floor now to Professor Vanessa.
Okay, obrigada pelo convite. Thank you, everyone. I think you hear me very well. I have a small request to make, which is that whether you can be very patient with me because I have an ear infection and it's not terrible, but I feel really disoriented. So maybe towards the lecture, if I confuse words, please be patient with me. But I actually have a word for Pedro of another regime that we could be facing in the future, which is kakistocracy, government by the worst, which is something of which we had some experience this week in the UK, if you have followed the news. But again, thank you for this wonderful invitation. I was absolutely pleased to receive an invitation from ICS, which has been always a center of reference for me, particularly in the last, let's say, 8 years since I started to be very interested about climate change problems in Mozambique. And I saw that a lot of the texts of reference on urban Mozambique were coming from here. So, yeah, my name is Vanessa Castanbroto, and my whole life is actually dominated by this question of your workshop. What urban futures and how we reach those urban futures? And this question is so important to me that I'm going to dedicate the next 5 years to study how do we deliver low carbon action in what I call ordinary cities, following Jennifer Robinson's provocation about the need to look for action beyond global spaces, global urban spaces, looking at the more ordinary spaces where people live. And that's the main theme of my new project, which is a project funded by the European Research Council and called LOACT, Low Carbon Action in Ordinary Cities. So today I want to speak about this project, but since it is a very new project, I only just have set it up. The story I will be telling you today is how did I come to be interested in this concept, low carbon action in ordinary cities, and particularly on the possibilities of more messy, chaotic understandings of urban governance. So my lecture is going to be divided roughly in 2 parts. On the first part, I'm going to talk about my trajectory in the last 5 years, talking about a concept that has dominated all my thinking called urban energy landscapes. And then I will explain how I moved from that concept to the new agenda of research that focuses on the messy politics of climate change in urban areas, with particular attention to these ordinary cities. But also, I wanted to say something about the theme of the conference, this idea of moving from crisis to hope. And it is rare in these days to talk about hope. A lot of the talk around climate change is very much doom and gloom. So, for example, in the last in the last week or 10 days perhaps, we've been reading this new report from the Breakthrough Institute in Australia, which I'm not sure what the intentions of the institute are, but the report actually says that the IPCC got it wrong, but not because if you allow me the reminder, the last report of the IPCC published last October said that we only had 12 years to address climate change. What the Breakthrough Institute in Australia, which is an institute somehow permeated by fossil fuel industries, what that institute is saying is that, in fact, we have much less time. So there are a lot of doom and gloom reports. And they can come in different guises. So, for example, we also have this report last week about big global companies saying that the impacts of climate change are going to cost them $1 trillion. In contrast, we had Philip Hammond in the UK saying this week that they will have to spend £1 trillion to address climate change. One wonders how this calculation come to be so neat. But the discourse is pretty much one of doom and gloom, and it has been for some time. I would say it has been like that at least since 2009. Why in 2009? Because in 2009 we have a conference of parties in Copenhagen, a conference of parties meeting in Copenhagen, one of the COPs, and it was an absolute disaster. It was the first time everybody agreed that there was not going to be an agreement to follow the Kyoto Protocol. And in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, but there's a fundamental difference between the Paris Agreement and the predecessor, the Kyoto Protocol, and it's that the Kyoto Protocol had a more regulatory orientation, whereas the Paris Agreement is all based on voluntary agreements. And that has created a radical change on how we think about climate policy and what is climate policy. In that gloom, let's say, I think a lot of people have looked towards urban areas as places of hope and places where action could be delivered and where effective action for climate change could be made. I mean, this interest in urban areas, on the one hand, is very positive because it makes you think about the possibilities of transformation at a more practical way. It also makes you think of specific ways in which we can direct climate finance to concrete actions on locales, on particular places. But as Simon Marvin would say, it also reminds you of a kind of moment in the 1990s in which urban areas were supposed to do everything, in which urban areas were this new hope, but they were also giving actors in urban areas, specifically local governments, were given responsibilities that they couldn't cope with. And this is very much what is happening in those cities around the world which are growing the fastest. In places where there are few resources, local governments may have squeezed capacities, we are adding additional work. Simultaneously, this urban optimism has been accompanied by a recognition of the multiple actors that operate in urban areas. And urban areas emerge as places where maybe businesses, communities, grassroots groups can take different forms of actions and challenge the political economy of the city, and through that, transforming the overall political economy of the country or of the world. So there I am. I've been recognized now for a decade as one person on my work on the last decade as a very positive person about urban areas, celebrating the value of urbanization to protect urban environments and address climate change. But I also recognize that there are very big contradictions embedded in this wave of urban optimism. So what I thought around 5 years ago is I started with a more basic question. So if we are thinking that what we need is a radical urban transformation to address climate change, my question was, how do cities change? We are talking about urban transitions or urban transformations, and there's a certain polemic about which of the terms is a bit better. Perhaps that's not that fructiferous, but what is really fructiferous for me is to think that we tend to think about transitions as processes that come from one state to another state, state A and state B. And both state A and state B are clearly defined. So we think, oh, we are in a sustainable city, and our state B will be a very sustainable city where everybody is happy and the process will be perfectly just. And obviously, that's not how change happens in cities. So I started to get interested in how, through history, and that's the result of almost 6 years of painful writing, really painful. And the question of this book is how do cities actually change when you look at them, and particularly how do they change with respect to their energy systems, because that's the challenge that we're confronted with today. And so my starting point is that we cannot think of today towards the future, but rather we have to understand change as happening within a long-term trajectory of change. And for me, a key moment was the electrification of cities. So I decided to look at how cities had been changing in, let's say, the long 20th century as the electricity was integrated in the urban fabric. But to start this discussion, I think this aligns very well with some of the questions that were asked before, we need to consider 3 propositions about how socio-material change and socio-ecological change happens in cities. First, we need to understand the relational nature of cities. So we have now a political ecology literature, but also a science and technology studies literature, which is asking us to look not just at social change and political change as if it happens separately from the change in the city, but also how that change occurs hand in hand with technological and ecological changes, which I would say socio-technical and socio-ecological change. And then you focus on that unit of change rather than thinking about specific technologies or specific moments of political transformation. Second, my second proposition in this book is that we need to look carefully at knowledge as the variable that determines how those changes happen. But knowledge is not like a reified thing that you can identify somewhere in the city and put it forward, but rather knowledge is, a plurality of knowledge intervene in this city. And here we need to think about our notions of change in line with the feminist critique of knowledge. And I look at how knowledges become situated in places and in spaces where those knowledges are produced, and towards the post-colonial literature that forces us to look at how models, by white male mostly, have been imposed on other peoples who didn't share those knowledges and for whom those models were not appropriate, not adopted, not even interesting. So a relational approach to energy infrastructure and the city, a focus on knowledge and particularly post-colonial situated knowledges, and finally, all my work builds very strongly on the literature on urban political ecology. And this is a body of literature that comes also from Marxist writers like Erik Svingerda, but also from feminist writers like Jaffa Trulov, for example, who are trying to look at how the materiality of infrastructure is actually shaping the socio-ecological configuration of the city. And what that forces us to look at is at infrastructure systems as heterogeneous systems, and systems that are almost appropriated in contingent locations, in specific places, to the point that even within the same city, you can find a variety of different configurations of infrastructure and people. And that's where the notion of landscape becomes really important. Landscapes, obviously, they emerge from the coevolution between social life and ecological life, and just by default emphasize the relational character of it. But also landscapes emphasize how certain forms of integrating energy and social life become coherent in some places, but also diversify through cities and across cities. So the book started also from that perspective. In fact, it emerged from a frustration because I was reading all kind of energy planning that was proposed for cities like Maputo, and it made me upset to think that models that when I didn't think were going to work in that city were constantly put forward as the panacea or solution for that city without even considering, for example, why people rely so much in charcoal, why the majority of people still see charcoal as their energy future. So this emphasis on imposing a certain model made me think that we needed to look more carefully at this heterogeneity of landscapes. So what I did, the problem of the concept of landscapes is that landscapes, urban energy landscapes almost refer to anything, refer to the provision of energy, refer to the infrastructure, refer to the use of energy. So how do you study such an abstract concept? So my book focuses on a framework that emerges from the literature on energy landscapes, but also a broader and now very diversifying literature on social studies of energy, of social science of energy. So I think energy landscapes can be understood as the product of three interrelated processes in the city. First, processes of governance, energy governance, where models of energy delivery and use are devised. Second, energy flows, which normally depend on infrastructures and on different forms of networking, for example, in the case of fuels. And third, energy choreographies that refer to the ways in which particular energy uses are adapted to the built environment. And based on this framework, I devised a methodology, and I applied this to 4 cities where I did qualitative interviewing, historical analysis, and participatory methodologies to think about the trajectories of energy change. And why I selected these 4 cities is because for me, they represent 4 different models of relating to energy, and therefore, they could represent 4 different models of being low carbon in the future. So for example, the first, is this pointer? Well, the first here on your top right is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a model of a compact city. It's often, like when you interview policymakers there, they often tell you Hong Kong is low carbon by chance, because we were so busy designing our transport that we did it in a way that is very efficient. But actually, it has very serious problems because there's an oversupply of electricity. The second one on the top is Bangalore. Bangalore is a city characterized by energy intermittency and lack of access, and the heterogeneity of the energy system is very prominent. But also, in terms of low carbon model, it's almost the opposite of Hong Kong, because it's a sprawling city, and there are some theories that say maybe there are alternatives to the compact city, for example, self-service suburbs and so on. The one at the bottom is Maputo, which is a city that I've been studying for some years. And for me, I thought it could be a good example of a city where there is very low consumption per capita of energy, even though, as we know, Mozambique is a very energy resource-rich country. And the final one is the metropolitan area of Concepción in Chile. This is actually one of the areas which is called Lota, and this is as a conurbated area, is a center of energy production that has national significance and is characterized by the strong presence of energy industries in the city that divides the city almost in 2 parts. One part of the city that is providing energy to the whole in the country, in Chile, and one part of the city that is almost practically autonomous but excluded from the main networks of energy supply. So that while maybe the most accommodated classes have access to, for example, natural gas, and the poorest families still depend on biomass. So the comparison of these 4 cities lead us to some conclusions about what urban energy landscapes are and how they relate to the concept of change and our energy futures. So for me, if I have to summarize the book in two kind of prescriptive ideas, one is this consideration that energy has become part of our being. The use of landscapes almost directly leads us to thinking of cities as places of dwelling, places where people are realized, the being of people is realized by their interaction with artifacts. And there I draw a lot on Martin Heidegger's work. So if we look at energy in this way, what we can make is a statement about how energy has become such an inherent part of our everyday life that we cannot conceive of our life without energy. And that's what makes it really difficult to change. So the fundamental kind of change that we need is of such magnitude that has to be directed beyond just making policy, beyond technologies. It has to be a more fundamental change about who we are. I would say even beyond cultural change. And that's the kind of change that we don't know how to do. We cannot imagine. It's very difficult. And this, why I think this is very interesting because there's where my ear, sorry. So I think this is a very important insight because it forces us to think that however different these energy systems are from one city to another, and these different urban energy landscapes are not comparable among the cities and within the cities, we still can see in every of those cities how energy has become such an important part of urban life. Like those cities cannot exist without that energy, and also those human lives also cannot. And the second insight is this idea about the heterogeneous relations in cities that are constructed around place-specific relations. So in the previous debate, somebody was saying, oh, climate scientists agree about the models of climate change and the kind of impacts that this is having, but they don't agree about the solutions. And maybe there's something there, but I think the more important point is that I really hope that nobody comes with an overall global solution for every city on the earth, because how these systems have to change will depend very much on how the cities already are and the kind of trajectories that they have gone through. And without engaging with that heterogeneity, we're really not making any impact. And that's why ideas like experimentation sometimes are not directed towards making a specific intervention to reduce a bit emissions or to create a possibility of adaptation, but actually experimentation is about challenging these sort of relations. So just to give you a little example, this is a photo from Bangalore. And as I say, Bangalore is a really interesting case because it shows, for example, that fragmentation in Bangalore relates to the governance of the city. So since its inception, the electricity system in Bangalore was not deemed to supply electricity to the whole city. It was assumed that electricity was a productive good, and it was emphasized that it had to supply industries and agriculture, which was considered the future of the state of Karnataka, where Bangalore is. So since that project of universal electrification was never there, the project of electrification of Bangalore was always fragmented from the outset. But as it developed, ideas of electrification permeated not just governance, but also the choreographies of practice that people had in their everyday life. And electricity became something important. For many people, electricity became a means, something that was combined with other fuels or with other means of accessing energy services. For other people, electricity would be always an aspiration, and still there's a lot of people in Bangalore that lack electricity, even within the city. So it's interesting also because informal settlements in Bangalore are dotted through the cities, through the whole city, rather than being separate, divided in big areas. So what you can see, for example, is in a normal life, you will have this landscape where there is a lot of blackouts and a lot of intermittency. So in a normal day, you will have electricity in the whole city, and you will have these spots of darkness where electricity is not reaching within the city, even in the central areas of the city. Then sometimes the monsoon, for example, is very hard one year, there's no water, and a lot of the supply depends on hydropower. Then the power goes off. Sometimes I am Skyping with colleagues who have an emergency supply of electricity, and they are in the darkness because they want to maintain the computer on. So colleagues working on the university who can access electricity services. But when you are actually in Bangalore and there's a blackout and you walk around, you will see dots of electricity, dots of light in those precise places where they are almost in the darkness, where everything is illuminated. And this is because now in those informal settlements there's been a distribution of more independent solar lamps which provide them with access. It's a very inadequate access and sometimes an intermediary stage to the network. But it's interesting to see how those patterns of electricity vary depending on the intermittency of the services. So what you see in this example is how the governance, the choreography of practice, and also the way electricity is supplied, or we could also make similar cases about fuels, interact into creating a particular landscape, a particular urban energy landscape. So just to finish this first part of the lecture, if we are thinking about these complex landscapes and how change happens, and we are thinking about how cities are shaped by these dwelling practices as well as governance discourses, then we go back to the original question, how can we make change happen? And here I find that these ideas of agency that have been really important in social theory may give us some insights about the nature of change. So for me, when we look at landscapes as places of dwelling, we can see of three forms of agency that interact and that are happening simultaneously. And I read them through the lens of theory. So one theory that has influenced me a lot through my career has been actor network theory, here, for example, represented by Bruno Latour most famously, but obviously much more extended. And the idea of actor network theory, as I understand it, is that you have certain actants, could be individual actors, but also sometimes even objects who have the capacity to create some sort of actor world. Within a strategic project, they have the capacity to enroll other actors and get convinced into that new kind of form of change that is happening. And agency can emerge as this distributed kind of power, but ultimately depends on strategic projects that some actors or sometimes things may own. So, for example, we can see that in projects of governance that create a particular narrative of how change is going to happen in the city and are able to enroll technologies into deliver that change. But a few years ago, I read the assemblage theory book by Landa, and what shocked me of that book in comparison to actor network theory was the emphasis in these kind of blueprints that are already present in our world and in our cities and in our lives. These blueprints that establish the boundaries of what change can be. And they are called, Solanda sometimes call them the diagrams. So the diagrams that enable, you can have a lot of creativity and a lot of strategic projects, but ultimately you have to refer to that ultimately blueprint that enables you to articulate that change. So agency is can operate within that diagram, within articulated that diagram, and related it to strategic projects or not. So both forms of agency, in a way, give you some ideas about governance, about policy. But through ethnography and participatory mapping of energy infrastructures, what I've become more interested in is how the everyday life can change, how a fundamental change of our being and our relationship with energy can happen at a more everyday, in the everyday context. Because when you look at the trajectories of these four cities and those landscapes, what you see is that change has happened, and it has happened, and a lot of it. And to explain that change, you really have to go back to those choreographies on a space and how they related to the particular flows, how a space was appropriated in particular locations like Bangalore. So what I found very interesting has been the work of feminist neo-materialist materialist theories, which a lot of whom refer to Donna Haraway and the idea of situated knowledge as a point of reference, but evolve those notions in terms of thinking, where is the agency if all knowledge is situated, if all knowledge is partial and dependent and also relates to our own individual self-awareness and so on? Where is the agency to change? So, for example, Rosi Braidiotti and more recently Karen Barat have been thinking about how agency happens in different forms of in-between people and things. So agency is not something that is owned, like in actor network theory, by any single actant, any single strategic project, but rather is something that emerges from the interaction between an individual, for example, and a thing, or between a community and the neighborhood. And it's in those possibilities that those diagrams of lambda shape the possibilities for action. But in the end, it's about maintaining and multiplying and diversifying those relations. Those are the moments where agency emerges. So these were the theoretical ideas that were emerging from my reading of trajectories of landscapes. But I thought, well, if I go back to, I don't know, any, like, you always get this comment, so yeah, but what does this mean for a worker in a municipality? I don't know, how should we apply this? And it's obviously difficult to say, because on the one hand, I have a very positive reading of this, and my positive reading is that cities change anyway, and in those changes, there's a lot of potentiality that can be harnessed every day. So we shouldn't be afraid of just making small experiments or small projects. But at the same time, I'm very cognizant of this problem of having a lot of local initiatives and devolve responsibilities to actors in the city doesn't solve our global problem of climate change and our global crisis. So how I move from this to a more global idea of governance, that's the point of departure for the new project. So this is a summary of my new project and my LOACT, Low Carbon Action in Ordinary Cities. And the central question, I think, is a question that has been embedded in sustainability debates ever since the idea of sustainability was coined. And it's this relationship between the global and the local. So this aspiration to have a global world, to address climate change, and this fact that we can only intervene in local spaces, that actual material changes happen always somewhere. So how do we understand that relationship? And that's where my hypothesis is that if, particularly in urban areas, which are the places where a bit more optimism is garnered these days, there are, this idea of messiness at least enables us to engage with how change happens over long-term trajectories and to think about transformation in a way that enrolls all the actors of the city and not just the policymakers who can make their voices heard. So in the project, I look at three things. I look at the ideals and models and the governmentalities of climate change, if you want, how they are translated into kind of ideas for local action in cities. I also look at policies and how they travel. So there's an emerging literature on policy mobilities, which I think is very influential and rightly so on climate change. So I'm looking at how the same policy, let's say bus rapid transit system, is translated from one city to another, let's say from Curitiba to Johannesburg. But in that process of translation, actually, that policies completely reassemble. I think that's a very interesting process that explains the relationship between the global and the local. But particularly because of my work on landscapes, I'm really interested in this idea that what happens and how we change and how we have urban transformations depends on the situated experiences of both the experience of the urgency of the response to the climate change challenge, but also the experience of action and the experience of outcomes. Somebody in the previous debate mentioned that this question of outcomes is a very important one. long do I have left, Lavinia? 10 minutes? Okay. So in the last 10, 15 minutes, what I'd like to do is to propose an initial framework for understanding messiness in governance, which is a work in progress. So it's the work in progress framework for the project, and maybe give an initial example that comes from my previous experience. So if you have comments on the framework, I think it's very much underdeveloped, so under development. So I'll be really happy to hear the comments. Because we start from the notion that the relationality of the city, the relationality of socio-technical systems and socio-ecological systems, and that relationality is particularly visible in urban areas, I think we have to start with a theory of governance that is also very cognizant of the relationality, the relational nature of power. And I think Foucault's theory of governmentality is is one that captures that very well, and that you can deploy to think about how authority is constructed in a particular way that focuses on orchestrating action around a particular goal and creating certain forms of order and ordering both what we are going to do and the results of what we are going to do. And this was something that I work a lot with Harold Buckley in our work on experiments. And I think from that work, I took away that there were three things that would, particularly in climate change experiments, there would be three different things that would be shaping very much how governmentalities of climate change were deployed in cities. So first, governmentalities always come with a will to improve. As Tanya Murray-Lee, the anthropologist, the American anthropologist, have explained very well. And that will to improve requires a strategy, requires purposive intervention, requires that deliberation to respond to an urgent challenge. So strategy is very central. And the other two aspects that I think are really important to understand governmentalities is this idea of rationality and calculus, of making plausible accounts of reality that enable you to intervene in a reality, so knowledge. And then on the other hand, this conduct of conduct, this focus on the subject and the body as a site of control. So these three aspects for me became really important through engaging with this theory. But the one thing I found when I started this project is that they are all concepts that refer to ordering the urban environment so that a governance intervention can be made. So I thought, what if we turn around each of those concepts into some sort of framework that recognizes how a strategy, how knowledge and calculation, how bodies and subjectification can be part of that messiness story, can be and the messiness of the story is what enable governing bodies and governing and using knowledge and governing knowledge and formulating strategies that enable governing. So, for example, one key idea that emerges very well from urban energy landscapes and through the history of energy development in diverse cities is that a lot of strategies emerge from the appropriation of place-based opportunities, and that those strategies are adapted over time in terms of depending on what the contingent situation makes possible. Another idea that emerged from this is that bodies can be governed as long as they are governed within a particular material contingency where that body is. And the same with knowledge. So knowledge can be deployed as a rationality or as a form of calculation as long as it makes sense within the situated context in which that knowledge is generated. So this is probably is within the interaction of these different aspects that notion of messiness can be constructed. So this is very messy at the moment, as you can see. It's as messy as governance, as climate change governance is. But I think it enables an initial point of departure to think about it. So just to finish, let me just give you a quick example. So let's imagine we are in Mozambique, and we are, which is one of the countries with the biggest deficit in energy access. Only I think it's 24% of the population has any access to electricity. Even when they have it, it's very precarious. And the majority of people depend on charcoal in urban areas or in biomass in rural areas. So it will make a lot of sense to think that a cook-stop program could be, a cook-stop improvement program could be a climate change oriented project, which will make a lot of sense there. Because on the one hand, we have to align climate change objectives with other co-benefits, like energy access. On the other hand, using an improved cook-stop reduces charcoal and reduces emissions, so in the long term, it makes a greener policy. And also, an improved cook-stop may theoretically be, may help to deal with some of the adaptation aspects, like, for example, reducing indoor pollution and facilitating adaptation. So it's a win-win situation, let's say. It's like improved cook-stops is a win-win situation, and many cook-stop improvement programs have received a lot of attention and a lot of financing internationally. So let's say this is our solution for Maputo. We are going to do a cook-stop improvement program. So how do we do a cook-stop improvement program? So we need several things. Okay, we need technology, no? We need a cook-stop of some sort that is better than the cook-stop that is being used. But you cannot just govern a city just by bringing a technology. You also need resources to bring that technology in, and to distribute it, and to bring it into the urban fabric, and to adapt it in the urban fabric. And you also need some destination for that technology. You need some people that use that technology. So, in the particular case, in less a theoretical case, because this is all anonymous, let's say. In Maputo, for example, you could have a bilateral organization which provides finance and provides the model of cook-stop improvement. But perhaps that bilateral, which is an organization that, or that international organization that has some place in Maputo but actually also works internationally, doesn't have the connection with the communities that are going to benefit from the cook-stop program. So probably what you need is some sort of partnership where you have a more local NGO who has the access to the community. Perhaps they have been doing planning with the community. They can come with a cook-stop improvement program and distribute it, and they know how to do it. They know how to deal with processes of local governance because maybe before they did other plans and other programs. So this program that we studied of cook-stop improvement, it worked like this at the beginning. But what happened? Where did the technology come from if the new cook-stops were not in Maputo? The technology, the cook-stops, were imported, in this case from the United States. So that created a lot of conflicts because the cook-stop, maybe not conflicts, but made that the program had some problems because those cook-stops that were imported, you can see them there, they were not adapted to the choreographies of everyday life. So, for example, women who are normally cook in these neighborhoods that use charcoal in Maputo, they would say, oh, it's too low, so it's not so adapted. It's also very small, so there are some meals that I cannot cook there. So maybe they will combine with the old cook-stop, and so on and so forth. So that kind of adaptation was not there. The other problem was how sustainable it is to deliver that cook-stop over so many years and to scale it up when you are importing those cook-stops. So it would be better to develop some form of local technology. So there are some models of local technology that they could use for this program. and that they were coming from other countries, but they had to be adapted to the industrial context and the kind of skills that were available in Maputo. So they partnered with a local NGO that had done other capacity building programs, and in fact, cookstop improvement programs have been working in Maputo for some time. But what happened was that as cookstops became part of the international climate regime and more funds were available for this type of program, then the actors involved saw the potential to improve, to scale up their program. Finance intermediaries emerged, which were organizations that were dedicated to justify the use of climate finance for these programs. But locally, you wouldn't have exactly the same capacity to actually develop those cookstops locally and distribute them across communities. And maybe that has other problems about what is the local governance and how is that operating there. What I have been seeing in the last few years is the proliferation of local NGOs which try to work directly with finance intermediaries, with other NGOs, and so on. But this is how this cookstop idea is being scaled up, if it's going to be scaled up. It cannot be scaled up just by a neat order partnership of a bilateral organization and an international NGO, maybe with some little partnerships here and there with local NGOs. No, this is how scale-up happens, by this complete messiness of new NGOs. In many cases, they are not new NGOs. They are NGOs that have been working for a long time in the city, but that they used to do other things. Maybe they were dedicated to waste management. But now, since resources come available to do these programs, they change their strategy. And that was the first part of the framework. They changed their strategy to adapt to the program. And equally, we can see, for example, knowledge has to be situated. And what you get is people that has been working in Maputo in cookstop programs without necessarily having a climate change rationale become really important actors for this climate change governance process. But also, who become really important actors from the beginning are the families that take the cookstops in their houses. And there is when we talk about choreographies of energy use and bodies, and the way energy becomes integrated in everyday life. So this is a starting point, maybe not as developed, and the ethnographic work and the more systematic work is still lacking. But hopefully, I have made a case both for having a more broad understanding of change within a long-term trajectory, and once you adopt that, once you start to think about dwelling the city and changing the city from multiple agencies, thinking about messiness and how messy the strategies of governance can be. That has a bit of a schematic case. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vanessa. We have time for questions, I think. So, anyone?
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, in this last model, why was the mess in the middle and not in the individual areas? That is to say, why is the mess concentrated where all apparently all ideas sit together to discuss the project? And why is it not when individuals appropriate the project and act by themselves?
Okay, so there is a, I don't know if, are we taking several questions or can I answer?
As you like.
Okay, maybe it's better that I answer this one. It's a very good question. And so I think it's very easy to justify that mess is part of urban life. I mean, that's not a controversial issue. What is a bit more controversial is that mess is part of governance, and even more controversial, which is my point, that focusing on mess is a way to think about transformation, a productive way to think about transformation and to think about purposefully governance. So I think my question is, where is the mess? So if we think about, for example, appropriating place-based strategies, which is the example of the cookstove that I have explained very schematically, we can still see a measure of ordering there. So I think mess will progressively appear as these different forms of messiness in governance interact. But that's still a working hypothesis. So I haven't had the empirical evidence to develop that in detail. But it's basically, you still, in the big circles, you still see a measure of ordering and authority.
About the cook stove, I would see the body of the cook stove in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So you have several agents from all the circles trying to get together to have a good idea. But then suddenly, those who are doing the place-based strategies, they're appropriating the idea and doing by themselves what they want. So to what extent is the combined program, it's certainly the origin of the mess. So it's the origin. But to what extent is not the individual appropriation, the interpretation they made and the actions they take that originates the multiple answers that we see on the terrain after?
Yes, that's definitely when we focus on a strategy, on the idea of a strategy. I think that's very well put how I think it works for now. But I think there's also other forms of messiness that emerge, which I've gone a bit fast because it was at the end of the presentation. But for example, in terms of the knowledge produced and how knowledge is articulated and where knowledge resides. So you have a model of a cookstove that is actually a template. I think it was created in Kenya and has been circulated for many places via NGOs. So, in fact, there are copyright disputes between those NGOs, right? And about, like, we've done it like this, we've done it like that, blah, blah, blah. But actually, the ones who have the knowledge of how to make it, there are people who are not recognized for having that knowledge. And that knowledge comes from very situational knowledge of how people cook, what they do, what materials are available, how much they cost, how long it's going to take me to cut the thing, and so on. So what we did last year, for example, I collaborated with designer, an engineering designer, an industrial designer. And what we said is, can we improve the design that people are using on the ground? Not the template that came from somewhere, from South Africa or whatever, but the template that people are using on the ground. And then we went there, and immediately a lot of kind of deficiencies. The engineers that studied this found many deficiencies. For example, they found that the cookstove is based on two pieces, and then what they do is they leave like a little part at the bottom, and then they cut it like this, and also in the other section, and then they join each little part together so that the two pieces come together. So that, from an engineering perspective, is like a waste of time. It's completely messy, and so we designed a template where it has a very easy kind of very ordered. How do you call it? Like little flaps that you can insert into each other. And when you design that with a 3D printer, you cut it and you assemble it together, it's a lot simpler. It's a lot easier. So we took the template to them, the whole template, so that they could just cut it like that. And what the guys who do the cookstoves, not the NGOs, what the guys who do the cookstove found is that for them, in the conditions in which they are doing, with the equipment they are doing it, and they know that they won't get better equipment, even if we can provide them the scissors, the design that they have is perfect. Our design is not an improvement over what they have. And that's where that messiness of knowledge in situ becomes really important. And that's a bit different from the strategy story that you were telling us.
Okay, I may have a slightly long one. So while I understand that there's this local variation, very contingent, towards these low carbon futures, I was wondering, in your kind of analytical framework, where are two things, and you mentioned Foucault, so where are the two things that are at the root of these contingents, which are urban histories, particularly, for instance, colonialized urban histories that have put universal provision of electricity and energy segregated on one hand, and on the other, where are the command and control institutions that disseminate these sort of remedial models? I'm looking at the cooked stoves, and I'm also thinking of Maputo's prepaid electricity meters, for instance. So it's all connected, and you can see how NGOs run to where finance is. So where does, in your analytical framework, which captures this local variation very well, where does the broad command enter?
I have another one here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was, for me, very stimulating. I work in public health and do quite a lot of work with World Health Organization around urban health and how we bring about health through the way we govern cities, in part. I'm interested in the distinctions you're making in your model between messiness and complexity, because I'm hearing a lot of the same kinds of dynamics, I guess, in how you're explaining some of your terms. And I'm wondering, how you're are you making a distinction between complexity and systems thinking and messiness, whether they're two different things, whether they're... And I guess the second part of that is how we can make use of your work in foresight and futures thinking, long-range planning.
What was the last question? Sorry.
How we can make use of your work in futures thinking and foresight work, particularly related to urban health or urban life.
There was another question? Oh. Okay, maybe I start with this question. So I think the distinction between messiness and complexity is really interesting. And I agree, like a lot of people say, oh, that's just the complexity of the situation. And you're just illustrating how complex it is. But as I understand complex theory, in fact, still complexity refers to a certain pattern of regularity where certain forms of emergency comes. And the problem is that we cannot diagnose them without knowing the initial conditions and so on. Whereas messiness thinking, for me, that's my interpretation, comes from a more, almost a cultural reading of the world. So we start from the assumption that as humans we can never access the world directly. It's always mediated by the way we understand it. And particularly, I have to declare my influences. I was very influenced very early on by Mary Douglas and the head-on idea about how our own culture and our way of being defines the world, make us see things as out of place, and therefore make us define what is messy and what is not. And that's different from complexity theory, where there's an engagement with the world as something that cannot be known because we don't know the initial conditions, but still there's some regularities to it. So somehow complexity theory has never convinced me, because there's still that aspiration of actually knowing it finally someday, the day when we will understand everything. And I think that aspiration is just futile, and it makes us waste a lot of time. But yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think probably this is something that's going to help me to develop this framework a lot. In terms of the use of this work on foresights and futures, I don't know anything about public health and how you take decisions. But in terms of planning, for example, urban areas, I've been long an advocate of planning that engages local communities and local conditions and that takes attention to what people need and why do they need it. Not that responds directly to what people need, but that understands that as a way of taking the decision. And I think when people who do foresight work with communities, I think you get the best results. But obviously that's not always possible. So in terms of the question about Foucault, well, there's two questions. One is about where does the governmentality theory fits here? Because in many ways, there are two ways of interpreting governmentality theory. One is as a critique of governance, and that's been very strong in my own work. But also thinking about how forms of authority are built over a climate change field, characterized by uncertainty. For me, governmentality theory is also important to understand how governance happens. So I don't think it's normative, but I think it helps you to think about what kind of connections you can establish. So there's a critique and there's a use of governmentality theory. So from that perspective, I think turning it on its head and thinking not just about how the world is ordered, but also how it's disordered is very important. Where does the broader chain of command and control, where is there? I think that's where maybe I have to reflect upon my own assumptions about how the city works, and I'm a bit skeptical about this idea that we can divide governance into different levels that are completely separated. So for example, if a municipal official works in a municipality, for that municipal official to actually do something that changes the city has to go somewhere and do it somewhere, whether it's in his office or her office, or whether it's in a neighborhood. So I think there, by separating structural governance powers from the actual processes of the city, we may be building a fallacy. But that's my own assumption, and I don't think it's a very common one. So maybe that's revealed in that question.
I think we have more questions here. There.
Very quickly, just contribution. So, on a brief introduction, I worked several years in Central America, and what you present is what we face there. About the money, when we start following the money, we start to understand this messy that you are facing when you need to, the flow of the money from the international finance institutions goes to the country. They cannot go for international laws, they cannot go to the state. So they need to go to some institution and then some NGO, and then you create a lot of fake NGOs or just superficial NGOs to receive the money and do certain things. So that is really a problem. So what we did in our work is when we really follow the money, where they come from, who are financing what, and who are financing who, we really map the NGOs that are working really locally with local community, and that help us to be more effective. The second thing on my experience on that is, in communication, we have a field that we call communication for development, and I work on that for a long, long time. And one thing that we use is diffusion of innovation that started as a theory in the 60s with agricultural models and agricultural producers, that from this idea that local people produce with less efficiency, the same thing that you were saying, and people from big countries and big corporations want to improve their lives, bring some innovation. And this particular model that we work in a participatory methodology, and in different ones, It's to understand that sometimes, as you said, sometimes what I have on that stove, that for an engineer is so hard to, because they have other standard point of view, but that one is perfect and work perfect in the condition that they have. So what we do particularly is to gather people from the local and do research on what they locally have developed, so we can improve from their perspective based on their needs and their lacks, because they have a lot, you know? So doing that, we were able to be more effective controlling vectors for the health, for the public health field. And we improved a lot in malaria and dengue and other disease, working really with the diffusion of innovation based on what the community creates for themselves. So I think those could be a small contribution for your process, for your thinking process, and help you to see that it's not an easy task. Yes, you're going to find a lot of messy things, but to avoid the messy, if you follow the money, you can map the money exactly where they go, and that is really going to give you another perspective, I think, if you do that on that specific climate change finance status. And the other hand, looking for more locally invention and help them create their own, their own site to improve and to enlarge the appropriation of that new technology.
Thank you. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I can comment. Yeah, I think maybe like 20 years ago, I believe I was maybe the last generation of students of both Niels Rolling and Jan van der Ploeg before they retired in Wageningen. So, and they both influenced me a lot, even though I only had one course with each of them. But yeah, I think probably the idea that there are local innovations is actually the central idea of my whole career. So I wouldn't contradict that. I think I think you see how people live, and then you see that they have worked through the history of the city, and not everything is positive, and there are maladaptations everywhere, but always I think you can learn a lot from whatever, from people's lives and experience. Perhaps I will contradict you a bit more on the follow the money thing, because through the history of those 4 cities I looked at their history, I think that when you see at the urban energy landscapes and how they change, money not always changes the system. It's a very important part. Governance is a very important part, but it's not the only part. And it's important to realize that, because there's a lot more attention at the money than the situated experiences. That also leads me a bit, so what messiness is in my view not something to be avoided. It's something to be recognized and work with. And for example, if you think about, I understand what you mean by saying that there are fake NGOs, because you cannot compare an NGO of somebody who suddenly has access to climate finance with the NGO that has worked for 20 years in a community and that is sensitive to the local conditions, maybe has agreements with the local chiefs or has worked with certain families, and there's a reciprocal relation between that NGO and the community, and that has to be valorized. I completely agree. But if we are going to think about messiness as a form of governance, we have to recognize that it's diversity and not one single model of NGO that matters. And perhaps that new finance-based NGO, which on the ground doesn't look that positive, may create a new dynamic that brings the innovation. So I think that's perhaps the innovation in my thinking. That while I recognize the role of those local NGOs and the work they do, and sometimes in very precarious conditions, there's this idea of what do the other actors do, and how is that change, how is that diversity created a form of change. But thank you for those comments, they're really useful.
One last short question, maybe? We have time? Okay.
Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to go back still to the...
Sorry, who is talking?
Me?
Ah, okay, it is.
Okay, so I just want to go back to the messiness term that you use, and I just feel, my question is messiness something contingent or something structural? And if it is structural, then what is the role of strategy, rationality, decision-making, coordination, policy-making? What is the role of that in the context of a structural messiness? The second question would be whether, particularly because in Mozambique, the urbanization rate, I mean, of course, Africa is undergoing, as a continent, is undergoing these rapid urbanization levels, but Mozambique is lagging behind what we see. So I'm thinking whether this question, instead of urban, could have rural areas instead of urban areas, and whether still we could extrapolate your reasoning to the same context. So thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, I had more questions, but about the messiness, it has been asked a lot. But I wanted then to ask you something linked to where Eduardo started, which is on your conceptualization of the South, which I'm not sure if I grasped, because, I mean, yeah, do you know the work by Jason Hickel? He's an anthropologist, Jason Hickel. Yeah.
Ah, yeah.
I mean, like, he has made this, I think, very compelling argument, not from an urban perspective, but from a global governance perspective, that if we have to, to learn how we can create more effective societies in terms of what the consumption we make and the quality of life that we can achieve, it's from the South that we have to learn. That the countries that are effective in this respect and that are sustainable are like Costa Rica, Cuba, Tunisia, Sri Lanka to some extent, etc., etc. They make a much better use of resources and of consumption than the West make. So it's in this respect a bit strange to me that when you're focusing on climate politics, then you focus just on southern cities, which may be the places that are actually already more effective in that sense, and not northern cities, which are the ones where we waste energy that is even useless from the point of view of making the good life. So that's how I don't understand how you use the southern lens in your choice of the cities.
Just to say, I really like the work of Jason Hickel and the degrowth theory. I think my reason to engage with the southern cities is kind of different, because what I've tried to do in my work has been more theory development. And I'm not posting, like, for example, on all my work of Maputo, I've never said, this is what Maputo have to do, right? Instead, I've said, this is what I've learned from Maputo. And, but the reason, the deliberate focus on cities on the south in the Urban Energy Landscapes project was because I was upset. I was upset about the models of energy development in urban environments that were developed, and they all come with the model of Barcelona or Paris or whatever, and all the histories of electricity development and energy development were very much focused, like all works on Chicago and Berlin and London and so on. And those are the histories that have shaped how technology and energy technologies are understood in urban theory. So my objective was really decentralized urban theory, and if we are taking a post-colonial or neo-colonial perspective, then you have to make a deliberate effort to think of models of other models of energy. Although, having said that, in the end I settled for Hong Kong, maybe because I felt that it really provided a very interesting example about how a city with the most abundant supply of electricity has still one of the most serious problems of energy poverty, which relate to space rather than to supply. So obviously research happens in mysterious ways. In the new project, I focus on 150 cities. Most of them are in a central belt in East and West Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The reason why is because these are the fastest growing cities in the world, under 1 million. These are the cities where most of the infrastructure is going to be built. Well, if it's built. And if it's not built, then we'll have a very interesting story as well, right? So there's it's a more a commitment to this notion of ordinary cities, a commitment to this post-colonial theory, not as a means to say this is what these cities have to do and they have to mitigate. I completely agree with that. And I like that idea that we can learn from the South a lot. We can learn from almost every place, right? But the problem is that we've been learning too much from the North and imposing those models on the South. And that's what neocolonialism is for me. Because knowledge is at the center of it. I really like those questions about Mozambique and saying that I should focus on rural areas is a very Mozambican question that a lot of my friends in Mozambique ask me all the time. No, I was not assuming that, but I have to say, like, I have a colleague that every time I see him, he's going to say, we have to work on energy in rural areas because they are the most... so for me, it's important to engage with urban areas because the global argument about how transformation can happen and how... But maybe if I was working only on Mozambique, I think you're right. I think there's a need to... there's particularly a need to challenge this dichotomy between the urban and the rural because that's how energy policy is being developed at the moment in Mozambique. So there's a part of the country that is supposed to be electrified. There is a part of the country that is not. And I think that's at its heart incorrect. The question about whether messiness is contingent or structural, I have not thought about it, so I cannot give you a very good answer. But yeah, I think maybe I'll think about it.
So, we have time for 3 more questions.
We have 2 more questions.
I'm sorry, I came in very late, but I think this concept is very interesting. But in the old days, we just used to talk about bottom-up or about social appropriation. So I would like to understand a bit better what messiness is about. What's different about it in terms of, involving all the different actors, bringing in, and it depends on the context you're in, trying to get them to appropriate things they're already using and improving on that. So I'd like to understand a bit better what this concept brings us beyond what we used to, the concepts we already had. And on the other hand, could you just, I'm very ignorant on this subject. Could you just tell us a little bit in urban areas? I mean, because it's easy to mess things up in a village, in a neighborhood, but when you look at a city, do you have to rely on local strategies, or can you combine different types of local strategies? Or, how do you get messiness going? How do you actually launch messiness? Thank you. And I'm sorry if you've already talked about this and I didn't catch on. Thank you.
I love it when somebody says, "Oh, I'm not very sure if this is the question," and then they make you a very difficult question. No, but very good one. I think the bottom-up strategy and the kind of social appropriation, appropriate technologies that are very central to my work. So they permeate a lot the examples I tell. But I think I'm not 100% sure that a theorization of the concept of messiness will revolutionize governance theory, but I hope it will do so. So perhaps with a better understanding about how there's that connection between the local and the global. But I have to say that I won't only be looking at situated experiences, which maybe is what aligns more with this bottom-up thing. But also, I'll be looking as well at policies and how they travel, how they are appropriated through messy processes as well. And also, I will look at, I'm looking historically at how different notions of the urban and urban interventions and the good city have been recreated in climate change policy. So it integrates different bodies of urban theory, and it builds on the shoulders of a lot of work that has been done before. So naturally, not everything is new. But perhaps I think by looking at this from the lens of messiness, maybe a different conceptualization of governance can be put forward. There was one last question.
Thank you. Can I ask you to just step back from the specificities of the project, which you so beautifully illustrate? I want to ask you a more down-to-earth question about as a scholar, because throughout these 4 days we've raised so many fantastic issues, and in the back of my mind, one in particular keeps coming back, perhaps because I spent the last 4 years thinking about what kind of knowledge we need to solve major problems such as urbanization processes and what they cause, the good and the bad. Question therefore is, in your experience, and you've got lots of experience, how do you deal with, how do you manage to bring together the different disciplinary perspectives that you clearly need to engage with any of this complexity? And throughout these 4 days, we've had diverse perspectives from different disciplinarians, but also the attempts, the difficulties of bringing them together, but the advantages of bringing them together as well. I mean, just before this session, we had a great exchange between geographers, political scientists, and the like. So how do you do it in practice? And what kind of lessons have you learned, given your extensive experience of doing that? Because we find things like time, resources, and careers all fall onto the line when you choose to engage with such complex projects, as opposed to something rather more simple that you can do more quickly with less resources, and certainly publishing in the right journals and getting the right ticks for whatever it is you want to do. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you know that I study engineering, right? You know that? And my PhD was on the sociology of engineering. And yeah, and now I work on an urban studies department after having worked on planning. I have no idea what is my discipline, so maybe ignoring that is important. But I don't know Portugal, so I think that depends a lot of the academic world in which we are living. So I'm being told that in Germany it's practically impossible to do what I've done with my career, because if you don't, there is only a selection of journals that you can publish in. In the UK, I think interdisciplinarity is very well priced. And I think it was one of the main reasons why I got this job, because it was specifically for interdisciplinary scholars. So I'm not sure, maybe I was a bit lucky. Very early in my career, I was very worried about this. And then I teamed up with a couple of friends. One was an anthropologist and one was an economist. And then we said, what are the barriers to do interdisciplinarity in academia? I mean, this we did it in 2008, so it's a bit dated now. But what we did is we went to interview sustainability leaders of sustainability thought. So we interview really cool people, like we interview Lynn Ostrom and Oran Jong and really nice people. I mean, I shouldn't say this because it's anonymous, I think. But it was really, we interviewed this cadre of really nice sustainability scholars, and then we did the analysis of what they had told us about interdisciplinarity, and they all say that interdisciplinarity was central to their career. They couldn't explain their career without interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity is what linked them to the real world, to complexity. Somebody was talking about complexity before, and it was really nice. But when we looked at how they were doing and the publications they were doing, they were all doing that within a particular discipline. So they would always refer back to their mother discipline, let's say, which in this in this case, it was the majority institutional economics. So I think there's a bit of a contradiction there between our aspirations as interdisciplinary scholars and the career pressures that we have. So maybe, I don't know, science policy is one way where you can have a discussion about that. I think the EU funding is quite good to promote interdisciplinarity as well.
More questions?
No.
Sorry. I should be quiet. I can't. So I have to ask this. I didn't see in your model anything about feelings, anything about emotions, anything about unpredictability, things that go astray. So the strategy concept that you gave there was very instrumental, calculative. Is there any kind of regime of action where you see where emotions, feelings, things that are not tangible? Is there anything? Is there hope in your model?
Yeah, I think so.
I
think so. So the ideas about situated knowledge making, they are all based on feminist scholarship. And that's really the work of starting in Donna Haraway and Rosie Braidiotti. I think it's really important to think about how knowledge is produced within that space. And then on the other hand, what I'd like to turn around is these ideas about subjectification and body control and biopolitics from Foucault that relate to the governmentality theory into a different way of thinking about material contingency. And how do you govern that space of the body in a place, which I think is mediated by affect. So in my book, I didn't use those concepts that strongly, but the notion of dwelling was very strong about how we build our sense of being through our everyday work, in which precisely those objective conceptions of the knowledge of the world around it, what Heidegger calls the present at hand world, are not that central to our being. Whereas the ready to hand, which is what we develop, those what I think are those affective relations with objects and material things of our task, how we do tasks, that's what really makes us and give us a sense of being. And that's why when energy is integrated in that kind of equipment around you, in those kind of objects that make your life meaningful and that give you a sense of being, it becomes something really difficult to change. So I would say that's very central to my work, and I'm sorry I didn't emphasize it more in the presentation.
What was the concept of strategy?
Yeah, it's just because I focus on that example about strategy.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Vanessa.
Okay, thank you.
I'll give the floor now to Olivia Bina.
Yes, I'll join you. With my name. I feel that one often stands between the people and the coffee, and I stand between you and the drinks. I don't know if that would be worse. Vanessa, I want to thank you because on top of it all, and having arrived just today, you're not feeling 100%. So thank you for bearing with us and for giving us the closing lecture of this journey into urban futures. A lot of crisis, a little bit of hope. We struggled with hope. I don't know what that means. But I've been asked to, well, I'm supposed to give you a closing remarks. And of course, everybody says when they have this position, it's an impossible thing to do. And I feel that it is a little bit of an impossible thing to do, but I've sorted it out in my mind with the wonderful word that I'm going to offer a few highlights of what struck me as particularly interesting and important in these 4 days. And before I do that, I want to ask, or rather to do that, I want to ask Mariana to come up and give us a first snapshot of our first 2 days, because what we have done, and not all of you have been able to follow, of course, all our journey, but we started off with a couple of days of warming up, using cinema as,
obrigada, using cinema. This is all a self-help stretch. To warm up in terms of the ideas, the concepts, and in fact the emotions was one of the... Oh, sorry. Yes, sir. Emotions was one of the key reasons why we started off with cinema, because we know how powerful that media is to raise those issues that we've been discussing in more scholarly form in the last 2 days in a very effective way. Oh, shut up, because it's...
Now it is, yeah. Thank you, Olivia. So yes, we started with 2 days of film sessions where we showed 9 short films in 2 sessions. And I think I want to say very briefly just 3 things about why I think it was important to show the films and kind of explain why we started with the films in addition to the affect question, which is something that definitely I would bring up. So thank you, Monica, for introducing that. The first reason why I thought it was important to show these films is that we wanted to open up the conference, and we wanted to open it up in the sense of first opening it, bringing it outside ICS and even outside the university, even though we did the screenings at a university venue in Kaleidoscopio, which is in Campo Grande, but also reach other public. So it wouldn't be a normal audience for an academic conference that would come to these films, and I think that was very important, and I think it did that. So that was something important. But we also wanted to open up the debate. So what are we using as a base for our discussion? And the idea there was to use other things other than concepts and to really use images. The second important thing about the films and about cinema is its illustrative power. So obviously films show us things. So we were looking at pictures. We were looking at specific pictures and specific landscapes and specific characters. Films also tell us stories, so they do that. They show us things by putting them together in narratives and by showing us things that have to do with emotions. So what are we feeling in relation to these characters, and how are we reading these landscapes was really important. And they allow us to enlarge the context. So we were looking at films from many different places, from pretty much every continent in the world, but also to look at particular places. So we had one session on Lisbon, and I think it was equally important to, on the first day, open it up, and then on the second day to really be specific about place in that sense. And then finally, and this is my struggle, as it were, to go back to Pedro's idea that whatever comes after in the future needs to start with a struggle, is that film is a specific language, and this is something that is very important, I think, for someone working on film in a social sciences institute. That is, it is equally important to notice what we see as it is important to understand how we see it. So how does camera work? How does editing work? How are things being shown to us? But also what we hear and what things films make us feel in addition to what things films make us see and know and think. So just to end with 2 very concrete examples from the films that we showed. On the first day, the debate was very much about dystopian, and everyone, the questions were almost upsetting because people said, but these films are horrible, they show us terrible futures ahead. And it might be so, but again, I think we need to go and analyze why it is that we're feeling dystopic when watching them, and that has to do with rhythm, so what is the sequence of the images that we're watching? That has to do with the effects, that is, what do we perceive as not real and not realistic, and that's something really important for us to understand reality. But it's also to do with, for instance, what do we perceive as being loud, so in terms of noise, what can we bear, and what is beyond bearable, and how we read silences, and it's not just to do with nature, but it's also how we read silence in the city that was very surreal in a way. And then on day 2, the films about Lisbon brought up a debate that João Seixas animated about precariousness and about alienation, which are obviously very important in contemporary Lisbon. But I think they also really showed us, in stylistic terms, a very clear sense of rupture. And here is where I thought the films were really about shifting paradigms and about bringing forward seeds of change that I hope really contributed to the debates that then went on in the last 2 days of the conference. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you also, Pedro and Lavinia, for selecting and organizing those 2 days. Oops, sorry. And now I would like to ask Roberto to also give us a little bit a few words on the contribution of ROCK's project, which is also standing on the other side of this room. So we've basically extended the concept of the annual conference of ICS as far and as wide as we could. And I also want to thank again Karen, because Karen was first very scholarly skeptical and asked hard questions, but then because she's a brave woman, she said, okay, I'll go along with that, and she allowed us to do a program which is very different, and I want to thank you again for that. And also, since I'm thanking, before giving Roberto the word, I want to thank again the team that has worked to do this, to coordinate this conference, which was indeed multiversed and is multiverse the right word? No. Diverse. And I want to thank you all very much for your input. Obviously, this was not going to happen without you, so I'm just keeping you all together, but thank you. Roberto,
well,
a few words on the knowledge.
Yeah, just a couple of words. I won't go into detail about how this H2020 funded project ROCK works. It's a project about urban regeneration and cultural heritage. But as a researcher in the field of participatory studies, I have to say that this project gave me and gave to the team, the ICS team working in this project, the opportunity to really give more impetus in this innovative approach, which is to really engage with local communities with the regeneration of some areas in the urban context that need some new food for critical thought on how to improve the living conditions. And at the same time, the project gave us also the opportunity to think about how we can, as researchers, how we can really engage with this community by taking into account the inequalities that exist in these small areas, and when compared with the rest of the cities. And we learned in this conference that we have always to take into account also the wider context, the global context. So, well, we have been very happy to collaborate in the organization of this conference. We think that we learned a lot by the speeches that have been provided by the keynotes in this conference, and we also think that something that we learned is also that the challenge of engaging with the local communities and the challenges related with these co-creative approaches are not only challenges for the cities, for the future of the cities, but are also challenges for the future of the universities. We do think that we have something to really discuss more seriously, which is how to rethink the way we shape and we produce scientific knowledge by taking into account a world that is transitating, to use the transition, transitating towards something that is new, and education is also scary, and we don't really know how to interpret and understand in order to understand if there is a hope. So, yeah, so basically just to conclude, I have the 3 or 4 points to provide, but just to say in a nutshell that we are being very happy to collaborate in the organization. And just to give an example of how happy we are very happy to have organized that exhibition in the room, in the multifunction room, and to give the stage to some young people that have engaged with us in the project. Just to give an example, we engaged with a group of young people that designed video games about the past, the present, and the future of Marvilla. And this is an output that I think that tells much more of all the words that I could share now with you. It's something that has a potential that we would like to improve in the next future, and that gathers a lot of complex dimensions that I would like to discuss now with you, but we don't have time. So just to say thank you, and thank to the people that have organized the exhibition, so the ICS team of the ROCK project, and also the people that have engaged with us from Marvilla. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Okay, so last 2 minutes, just a couple of reflections on those highlights that I've noted. I really enjoyed finding a lot of continuity in a couple of things that I think as a hub within the RG, the research group's environment, territory and society, we really need to think how we contribute to these cross-cutting themes almost. And one of them is that almost all our speakers and discussants have touched upon an idea of long-term trajectories, one way or another. To understand the nature of the challenges, there was always a call to look back as well as to look at the present in order to think about the future. Morozov yesterday made a leap back to at least the 1970s to explain what digitalized futures will look like. And today we've touched upon this in many different talks. I particularly remember Pedro's comment looking at the future of our democracy and the roots of what we hold dear in terms of the current model, its shortcomings, but how we need to always look back at the present and forward. And we have in this institute a tremendous resource, which is that we have tremendous capacities to look backwards. We have historians available, but we can do better in terms of working together. And I think this is one of the messages that I bring forward for this particular challenge of looking at the urban nexus. We've also talked a lot, joyfully, as an ex-geographer, about scale. And this has been the other elephant in the room. No matter which angle of the urbanization processes, whether we were talking about rights and politics or we were talking about technology and nature, scale was always there as a challenge. It's always a tension between the local and the global. And we've had Vanessa's final presentation, which was trying to address this with a new lens, with new methodological lens, and in different ways and in different cases. But it's been a theme throughout the 4 days, and I found it was important and interesting. And I think we also need to rethink how do we contribute to this, because it is a persistent challenge for us, and it's not perhaps as high on our agenda as it should be. So basically what I'm saying is that we're exploiting these 4 days to rethink how we can do better as a group in addressing this topic, which for us is very important, as we've tried to demonstrate throughout these 4 days. I'm going to leave it here because in terms of knowledge, well, the last topic that also was cross-cutting is we've all inevitably reflected on what kind of knowledge and knowledges and whose knowledge, including the issue I raised here about interdisciplinarity, but we've talked a lot about the co-production, whose knowledge we can involve, and the importance of, for us at least, to try and engage more and more with other means, including media, in different ways. And this is also central to both the research group that we belong, but I think the Institute itself has this strength and is building more and more a position in terms of experiencing, practicing, and redefining our methodologies along these much more complex angles and lines. And collaborations, I mean, ROCK being one example, but just one, really, of the many projects that we have in this sense. So on those 3 axes of further challenges and further food for thought, I think I should thank everybody again, thank the Institute for giving us the challenge of this topic, my colleagues, all of the colleagues of the Institute who've helped massively in the communication, structuring of the logistics, let's say, of this conference organization. And thank you all for hanging around until the very end, which has been a long journey. So thank you all, thank you to the speakers, thank you to the team.